Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. I am really glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable. Pull that blanket a little closer because tonight we're going to talk about some of the most extraordinary women who ever lived. Women who wore crowns but slept with one eye open. Here is a question I want you to sit with for just a moment. What if the most dangerous thing a woman could do in all of human history was not cross an ocean, not face a plague, not survive a war, but simply say, "I do," to a king? What if the golden crown placed on her head was not a reward but a target? And what if the women who survived, truly survived, did it not with luck, but with a level of quiet brilliance that most people never get credit for? That is exactly what we're going to explore tonight. So, stay close. This story is just getting started. Before we go any further, if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, do me a small favor. Give this video a like, subscribe if you have not already, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from tonight. Are you in bed? On the couch? Somewhere unexpected? I love knowing it. It makes this feel less like a broadcast and more like two friends sharing a story in the quiet. Now, if you can, dim those lights. Let the world outside go a little softer, and let us begin. Let me paint you a picture. The year is 1533. A young woman named Anne sits in a grand chair, dressed in robes so heavy she can barely breathe. Around her, thousands of people are cheering. She's about to become Queen of England. She's 26 years old. Clever, witty, magnetic. She has fought for years to reach this moment. She outmaneuvered rivals, charmed a king, and helped reshape the religious landscape of an entire nation. 3 years later, she was dead, executed on the orders of that same king. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. The jury was handpicked by men who wanted her gone, and Anne Boleyn's story is famous. But here is what almost nobody talks about. She was not the exception. She was closer to the rule, because here is the truth that history textbooks tend to gloss over. Being a royal wife, especially in medieval and early modern Europe, was statistically speaking one of the most dangerous positions a person could hold. We hear a great deal about the dangers men faced: war, dueling, political betrayal. But the dangers for royal women were quieter, more intimate, and in many ways far more relentless. Think about what a royal marriage actually meant for a woman in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. It meant being sent, sometimes as young as 3 or 4 years old, to a foreign country. It meant learning a new language overnight, abandoning everything familiar, and being immediately judged on one single thing above all else. Could she produce an heir? Not 2 heirs? Not a healthy daughter? A son, a legitimate male son. If she could, she might be safe for a while. If she could not, through miscarriage, through stillbirth, through the simple cruelty of biology, she was vulnerable. And vulnerability at the highest levels of power had a quiet way of becoming fatal. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is not just a story of victims. That framing does these women a serious disservice. The women we're going to explore in this series were not passive. They were not simply waiting to see what their husbands would decide next. They were strategists, survivors. In many cases, they were playing a game of chess, so sophisticated that the men around them did not even realize a game was being played. But before we get to the strategies, we need to truly understand the world these women were walking into, because you cannot appreciate how remarkable their survival was without first understanding exactly how dangerous the game was. Let me give you a sense of just how high the stakes were. Historians who have studied the fates of European queens consort, women who became queen by marrying a king rather than inheriting the throne themselves, have found a striking pattern. Between roughly the year 1000 and the year 1600, across England, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, a significant number of queens died before their 40th birthday. Many died in childbirth, but a surprising number died under circumstances that were at the very least politically convenient for someone else. In England alone, within a single century, the 1500s, 2 queens were formally executed. Several others were imprisoned, divorced, or publicly discarded. One died almost certainly from the psychological and physical toll of being stripped of her title after more than 2 decades of marriage. That woman was Catherine of Aragon, and her story tells us something important about what survival actually looked like. Catherine was not a fragile person. She'd been raised by Isabella of Castile, arguably the most powerful monarch in all of Europe at the time, a woman who personally commanded military campaigns. Catherine was educated, multilingual, politically astute. She knew exactly what was happening when Henry VIII began pushing her aside, and she fought it, but in a way most people do not fully appreciate. She never physically rebelled. She never plotted against the king directly. Instead, she did something far more sophisticated. She made herself a symbol. She appealed to the Pope. She wrote to her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who happened to control much of Italy, which put the Pope in a very uncomfortable position. She cultivated loyalty among ordinary English people who genuinely loved her. She framed her resistance not as defiance, but as faith, as righteousness. As a duty, was it enough to save her marriage? No, but it almost certainly saved her life. While Anne Boleyn went to the Tower of London, and then to the scaffold, Catherine died still insisting she was the rightful queen. Never accepting the humiliating title, Henry tried to force upon her, in her bed at 50 years old, with her dignity intact. In a world where the alternative was a cold morning on Tower Green, that was not a small thing. Here is what I find genuinely fascinating about this. We tend to romanticize royal life, the castles, the gowns, the candlelit feasts. And yes, there was beauty in it. But the women who actually lived inside those castles, wearing those gowns, sitting at those feasts, many of them understood something very clearly. The crown was not a prize. It was a job. The most demanding, most scrutinized, most unforgiving job imaginable. One where you could be dismissed at any moment. And dismissal sometimes meant exile, sometimes imprisonment, and sometimes something far worse. A French diplomat, writing about the English court in the 1530s, captured it perfectly. He described the life of a queen as being like walking through a garden of beautiful flowers that were also knives, beautiful and dangerous all at once. So here is the question driving everything we will explore together in this series. How did the ones who survived actually survive? Not just physically, but with their minds, their dignity, sometimes even their power intact. Because some of them did far more than survive. Some of them accumulated real influence, real authority, real historical legacy, in a world structurally designed to reduce them to a single biological function. Was it cleverness? Absolutely. We will talk about the intelligence networks some queens built, actual systems of informants, and coded correspondence. Was it alliances? Yes. The women who lasted longest were almost always connected to powerful people outside the marriage. Was it performance? Often. Knowing when to appear harmless, deeply pious, or simply too beloved to touch. This was a survival skill as practiced as any art. The answer is all of these things. And there is a pattern. A real historically documented pattern. Over the parts ahead, we're going to trace that pattern together. We will meet women who were sent across Europe as children, women who navigated poison, betrayal, and public humiliation, women who found ways against extraordinary odds to hold on to something. Sanity, status, love, legacy. And I think by the end, you're going to see these women very differently than most history books do. Not as beautiful decorations in the margins of history, but as some of the most resilient, most quietly extraordinary human beings who ever lived. Coming up next, I want to take you back to the very beginning, not the wedding day. Before that, because the danger for these women did not start when they said their vows. It started the moment their father picked up a quill and signed his name on a piece of paper. And what happened between that signature and the altar is one of the strangest, saddest, and most surprising stories in all of women's history. Stay with me. So that signature, a father's signature on a piece of parchment, that is where this story truly begins. And I want you to really sit with that image for a moment, because there is something almost unbearable about it when you think about it honestly. Somewhere in a candlelit room, a king or a duke or a powerful nobleman dips his quill into ink. He signs his name. He presses his seal into wax, and somewhere down the hall, a little girl is playing with her dolls, completely unaware that her entire life has just been decided for her. She might be 6 years old. She might be 4. In some recorded cases throughout European history, she was barely old enough to walk, and just like that, she belongs to someone else's future. This is the part of royal history that tends to get softened or skipped over entirely. We jump ahead to the gowns, the ceremony, the romantic tension. But the truth of how these marriages began is something altogether different. The betrothal system in medieval and early modern Europe was not a romantic institution. It was a diplomatic one. It was, to be blunt about it, a sophisticated form of human exchange where daughters were the currency. A king needed an alliance with France. He promised his 3-year-old daughter to the French king's son. A duke needed peace with a rival. He offered his infant girl as a future wife. A dynasty needed to secure its claim to a contested throne. A child bride was the solution. And here is the thing that strikes me every time I read about this period. The children involved had no say whatsoever. Not in the pairing, not in the timing, not in the country they would be sent to, and not in the man they would spend their lives beside. The legal minimum age for a binding betrothal in much of medieval Europe was 7 years old. 7. Though in practice, agreements were made even earlier, with the formal ceremony simply waiting until the child reached that age. Can you imagine being 7 years old and already promised? Let me introduce you to someone whose story brings all of this to life in a way that still makes me catch my breath. Her name was Isabella of Valois, and she was 6 years old when she was betrothed to Richard II of England. 6 years old, she was the daughter of the French King Charles VI, and the marriage was arranged as part of a peace agreement between England and France. The two nations had been tearing each other apart for decades in what we now call the 100 Years' War. Isabella was described by contemporary accounts as a lively, bright child. She reportedly charmed everyone she met, including Richard himself, who, to his credit and somewhat unusually for the era, agreed to wait until she was of marriageable age before the union was consummated. She arrived in England in 1396, surrounded by French attendants, speaking no English, in a country she had never seen before. She was 7 years old at the time of the formal marriage ceremony. Now, pause for a second and think about what you were doing at 7 years old. I was worried about whether I would get the right flavor of birthday cake. This child was Queen of England. But here is where Isabella's story takes a turn that illustrates something crucial about the world these girls were entering. When Richard II was deposed in 1399 and Henry IV took the throne, Isabella, then 10 years old, suddenly found herself in a political limbo that most adults would have found impossible to navigate. Her husband was gone. Her position was erased overnight. She was a foreign-born, former queen in a country that was actively trying to erase the previous reign from memory. What did Isabella do? She demanded to go home. Not in a childish crying way, though she would have had every right to cry. She negotiated. She appealed to her father's ambassadors. She insisted with remarkable clarity for a 10-year-old that her dowry be returned and that she be treated with the dignity her rank deserved. It took 2 years, but she got it. She returned to France in 1401, dowry and honor more or less intact. And here already you can see the seed of what would become a recurring survival pattern across centuries of royal women. The ability to hold yourself together in chaos, to know your legal rights, and to never fully surrender your identity to someone else's political game, even when you are a child. Of course, not every story ended even that well. Marguerite Beaufort is a name that deserves far more recognition than it typically receives. She was the mother of Henry VII, the first Tudor king, which means she is in a very real sense the grandmother of the entire Tudor dynasty that would define English history for over a century. But let us talk about what happened to Margaret. Before any of that, she was betrothed for the first time at age 1 year old. That agreement was later dissolved. She was then betrothed again at age 6 and formally married at 9 years old to John de la Pole, though that marriage was annulled before it was consummated. Her third marriage, the one that would matter, came at age 12. She married Edmund Tudor, who was 24 years old. She became pregnant almost immediately. At 13 years old, Margaret Beaufort went through a labor so prolonged and so physically devastating that historians believe it permanently damaged her ability to have more children. She survived. Her son survived. But the trauma of that birth, at an age when her own body was still growing, shaped the rest of her life, in ways both visible and invisible. And yet, Margaret Beaufort did not break. She became one of the most remarkable political operators of the 15th century. She educated herself extensively, at a time when most women had no access to formal learning. She built alliances carefully and patiently over decades. She funded the founding of 2 colleges at Cambridge, and she lived long enough to see her son crowned King of England. She was a strategist of the First Order, but the foundation of everything she became was built on bones that should never have been tested that young. There is a modern tendency to look back at these arranged marriages and say something like, well, that was just how things were done, as though the historical distance makes it neutral, as though the children involved did not see it. But the letters and personal accounts that survive, and some do survive, tell a different story. In the early 16th century, a young noblewoman named Anne of Cleves was selected as the 4th wife of Henry VIII, sight unseen, based almost entirely on a portrait painted by Hans Holbein the Younger. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, negotiated the match for political reasons. England needed a Protestant ally in Northern Europe. Anne had no meaningful choice in the matter. She left her home in the Duchy of Cleves, traveled across a cold winter sea, and arrived in England to meet a man she had never spoken to, in a language she did not speak, in a country whose customs she did not know. Henry famously was disappointed on first sight. He had expected the painting. What he got was a real person, a real nervous, bewildered human being who was doing her absolute best in an impossible situation. What happened next is, in a dark way, one of the more interesting survival stories of the Tudor period. Anne agreed to an annulment quietly, gracefully, without protest, and in doing so she did something almost no other woman in her position had managed. She walked away. Henry gave her a generous settlement, properties, income, a household of her own. She lived in England for the rest of her life, comfortable and free, outliving Henry himself by 10 years. The unofficial verdict of history is that Anne of Cleves may have been the smartest of all Henry's wives. Not because she was the most brilliant or the most beautiful, but because she understood instantly what the situation required. She let go, and by letting go, she held on to everything that mattered. This is something I keep coming back to as I think about these women and their stories. The ones who tried to hold on too tightly to what they thought the marriage should be, to love, to pride, to the crown itself, often came to grief because of it. The ones who understood that survival sometimes meant releasing your grip, repositioning, adapting, they tended to fare better. It is almost counterintuitive, is it not? In a culture that celebrated loyalty, constancy, and devotion in women above almost all else, the women who survived were often the ones who had quietly learned to be fluid, to be water, rather than stone walls, to find the path of least resistance, without ever losing sight of where they ultimately wanted to go. And where did most of them want to go? Home, safety, some version of a life that was theirs. The means of getting there varied enormously, and that is exactly what we're going to spend the rest of this series exploring. But I want to leave you with one final thought before we move into our next chapter. There is something quietly devastating about the fact that so many of these women spent their entire adult lives being extraordinary, strategic, resilient, creative, and history remembered them mostly as footnotes to their husbands' stories. Margaret Beaufort gets a paragraph or two in books about Henry VII. Isabella of Valois is usually a side note in the story of Richard II. Anne of Cleves is punchline number 4 in the famous rhyme about Henry's 6 wives. But when you actually look at their lives, when you sit with the details, the choices, the sheer endurance it took, they are anything but footnotes. They are the whole story. And speaking of the whole story, what happened after the wedding itself is where things get truly complicated. because signing the contract and surviving the ceremony was only the beginning. Once these women were inside the marriage, inside the palace, inside the political machinery, a completely different set of dangers appeared. Some of them came from enemies, some of them came from allies who turned, and some of the most treacherous the ones that are hardest to defend against, came from the very people who were supposed to love them. That is what we are stepping into next, and I promise you, it is not what you expect. Right then, let us talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the king on the throne. We spent the last chapter looking at how dangerous the road to marriage could be. The contracts, the betrothals, the children packed off to foreign courts before they had lost all their baby teeth. But what happened once she arrived? Once the ceremony was over, the feasting done, and the palace doors closed behind her, what happened when the husband himself was the threat? Here is something that might genuinely surprise you. When historians examine cases of queens who came to grief throughout medieval and early modern history, not just in England, but across Europe, into the Byzantine Empire, across the Ottoman world, and into Imperial Russia, one pattern appears again and again with uncomfortable consistency. The single most dangerous person in a royal woman's life was almost never a rival, almost never an enemy from another kingdom, almost never a scheming courtier or a jealous sister-in-law. It was the man she had married. Now, I want to be precise here because history deserves precision. I am not saying every royal husband was violent or malicious. Many were not. Some royal marriages were, by the standards of their time and even by any standard, genuinely loving partnerships. But the structural reality of monarchy created a situation where a husband held total legal, financial, and physical authority over his wife, and where a wife who had become inconvenient, politically embarrassing, or simply boring had almost no institutional protection whatsoever. And some men used that power in ways that should never be forgotten. Let me take you somewhere most people never think about when they think about dangerous royal marriages. Constantinople. The year is 1183. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of the old Roman world, centered in what is now Istanbul, had a long and genuinely remarkable tradition of powerful empresses, women who had ruled in their own right, who had commanded armies, who had shaped theology and law and architecture. But it also had a tradition of something else. Emperor Andronikos came to power through a coup that involved the murder of the young Emperor Alexios II, who was about 14 years old at the time. Alexios had a wife, Agnes of France, who was around 11 or 12 years old, the daughter of King Louis VII of France. After disposing of the young Emperor, Andronikos, who was in his 60s, married the child widow himself. Agnes had no say in any of this. She had been sent from France as a diplomatic peace offering. She had been married to one boy emperor, widowed, and then married to the man responsible for her first husband's end, all before she was a teenager. What happened to Agnes after that is one of those stories that gets buried in the footnotes of Byzantine history. When Andronikos himself was overthrown and killed in 1185, Agnes, now perhaps 15 or 16, was simply passed along to the next emperor, Isaac II Angelos, who married her. She had been treated from the age of 9 onward as a possession to be transferred between powerful men, and yet Agnes of France survived all of them. She outlived 3 emperors. She eventually returned to the Latin world, remarried again, and died, as far as historians can determine, peacefully somewhere around the year 1220. There is something almost defiant in that outcome. A girl who had every reason to be destroyed by the machine of Byzantine politics simply kept going, kept adapting, kept surviving. How? Partly because she was young enough to be underestimated, partly because she was foreign enough that no faction saw her as a genuine threat, and partly, I suspect, though the sources do not tell us directly, because she learned very early to make herself useful to whoever was currently in power, without ever attaching herself so thoroughly to any one of them that his fall would take her down too. That is a skill, a hard one, painful, quietly brilliant. Now let us move further east and further forward in time to a court that makes the Byzantine palace intrigues look almost gentle by comparison. The Ottoman imperial harem, And I want to immediately push back against every Hollywood image those words might conjure, because the reality was both more complicated and more interesting than the popular imagination tends to allow. The Ottoman harem was not primarily a place of pleasure. It was a political institution, a highly organized, deeply hierarchical system in which women competed, sometimes fiercely, for influence, for their children's survival, and ultimately for their own lives, and the stakes were not metaphorical. Here is a fact that tends to stop people cold when they first encounter it. Under the Ottoman system known as fratricide law, and the word is exactly as stark as it sounds, when a new sultan came to power, it was not merely customary, but legally sanctioned for him to have his brothers executed, all of them, in order to eliminate rival claimants to the throne. What does this have to do with the women? Everything. Because a mother in the Ottoman harem was only as safe as her son. If her son became sultan, she became sultan. She became the Valid Sultan, the sultan's mother, one of the most powerful positions in the entire empire. She controlled the harem. She influenced appointments. She shaped policy in ways that most Western courts would not have recognized in a woman. But if her son lost, if he was passed over, or if he was one of the brothers who did not survive the transition, she lost everything, sometimes including her life. This meant that the women of the Ottoman harem were engaged in a constant, years-long political competition that made the intrigues of any European court look relatively straightforward. And within this system, one woman rose to a level of power so extraordinary that she is still being debated and analyzed by historians today. Her name was Hurrem Sultan. You may know her by the name Roxolana, though she herself would not have used that name. She was likely born in what is now Ukraine, taken captive as a young woman, and eventually entered the household of Suleiman I, who has become known to history as Suleiman the Magnificent. Hurrem did something that had essentially never been done before in Ottoman history. She convinced Suleiman to legally marry her, not just keep her as a favored concubine, actually marry her, give her the formal status of his wife. This was so far outside the norms of Ottoman practice that it genuinely shocked the court. A contemporary Venetian ambassador wrote with barely concealed disbelief that the Sultan had done something unprecedented. He could not quite bring himself to believe it was real. Why did it matter so much? Because legal marriage gave Hurrem a formal standing that a concubine could never have. It protected her son's claims. It gave her a platform from which to exercise political influence that no previous woman in her position had possessed. She used that platform relentlessly. She corresponded directly with foreign rulers, the King of Poland, even the King of France. She commissioned mosques and hospitals and charitable foundations. She shaped succession politics in ways that historians are still unraveling. Was she ruthless? The sources suggest she could be. She has been accused, though the evidence is complicated, of England in airing the downfall of the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, who was Suleiman's closest friend and later of Suleiman's own son from a previous relationship. Whether every accusation is true, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is this: she entered the Ottoman system as a captive girl, with no rights and no protection, and she navigated that system which was designed to reduce women to interchangeable instruments of dynastic reproduction into a position of genuine, lasting, documented power. She did not do it by being passive. She did it by being, in every room she entered, the most politically intelligent person present. Closer to home now, and I mean that literally. If you are anywhere in Europe or America tonight, let us talk about a pattern that ran through royal courts, from Paris to Madrid to Vienna. The political dismissal. This is the quieter version of the danger, and in some ways the more insidious one because it did not always end in death, but it was designed to destroy. The pattern worked like this. A queen falls out of favor, perhaps because she has not produced the required heir, perhaps because the king has a new romantic interest, perhaps simply because she has grown politically inconvenient. What follows is not necessarily dramatic. It is slow, methodical, and designed to leave the woman with nothing. Her attendants are replaced one by one with people loyal to her enemies. Her correspondence is monitored. Her access to the king is restricted. Her household budget is cut. Rumors begin circulating about her character, her fidelity, and mental stability. The rumors are almost always false, but they do not need to be true. They just need to be repeated often enough that people begin to wonder. And then one day she wakes up and realizes that she has been surrounded, very carefully and very quietly, by people who want her gone. This is exactly what happened to Eleanor of Austria, who was Queen of France in the 16th century as the wife of Francis I. Eleanor had married Francis as part of a treaty, the Treaty of Madrid in 1526, following Francis's humiliating capture at the Battle of Pavia. She was the sister of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, which made her enormously valuable as a diplomatic piece. Francis married her, but he never particularly wanted to. He had a long-standing romantic interest, Anne de Pisseleu de Hailly, who wielded extraordinary informal influence at the French court. Eleanor was essentially ignored from almost the moment she arrived. She was not executed. She was not imprisoned. She was simply set aside, made irrelevant, rendered invisible in her own court. Eleanor's response was quiet, and I find it deeply dignified. She did not fight publicly. She did not create scenes. She maintained her relationships with her brother, the Emperor, which was actually the one thing that kept Francis from treating her even worse. Since offending the Holy Roman Emperor was not something any French king could afford to do carelessly, she focused on her children. She cultivated her own small circle of loyal attendants. She waited. Francis died in 1547. Eleanor outlived him. She spent the final years of her life between Spain and the Low Countries, moving between the courts of her Habsburg relatives, living on her own terms. She died in 1558 at 56 years old, having outlasted the king who had treated her as an afterthought. I think there is something almost quietly satisfying about that. And this brings me to something I want you to really think about. When we talk about royal women who survive dangerous marriages, we often focus on the dramatic cases, the executions, the imprisonments, the public scandals. And those matter. They absolutely matter. But there is another kind of survival that deserves just as much attention. The survival of women who were systematically marginalized, who had their power quietly dismantled piece by piece, and who found ways to hold on to their sense of self anyway. That kind of survival requires something different from dramatic courage. It requires patience that borders on the superhuman, the ability to absorb humiliation without letting it hollow you out, to maintain relationships and influence in the margins and the spaces the powerful men around you do not bother to monitor, because they do not think those spaces matter. And here is the thing about those margins. Sometimes they turned out to matter enormously. The women who tended those quiet spaces, who wrote letters, who maintained friendships, who cultivated loyalty in their households and chaplains and ladies-in-waiting, often emerged from their marriages with something the men had not intended to leave them with, a foundation, something to build on. Which brings us naturally to a question I have been turning over in my mind as I put this series together. What was it specifically that the women who survived best actually had? Was it connections? Yes, and we have touched on that. Was it intelligence? Obviously. But I keep coming back to something else, something harder to name. I think the women who navigated these marriages most successfully all had, in some form, a very clear, internal answer to a question that most of us never have to face so starkly. The question was this: who am I apart from this marriage? The ones who had an answer, a real answer rooted in something outside the husband's favor, and the court's approval, tended to be the ones who endured. And some of them had been building the answer long before the danger arrived. The way they built it, through education, through faith, through the cultivation of their own networks and resources and identities, is one of the most fascinating threads in all of women's history. And that is exactly where we are headed next. Because the smartest royal women did not wait for danger to find them before they started preparing. They had been preparing all along, quietly, methodically, often right under the noses of the men who thought they were in charge. What that preparation looked like, and just how sophisticated it actually was, is going to genuinely change how you see these women. Stay with me. There is a scene I want you to picture. A queen sits at her writing desk, late at night. The candles are burning low. Everyone else in the palace has gone to sleep, or at least they appear to have gone to sleep. which in a royal court are two very different things. She is writing a letter, but she is not writing it the way you or I would write a letter. She is writing it in a code that only the recipient will understand, a system of substituted letters and agreed-upon phrases that, to anyone else who intercepts it, looks like perfectly ordinary correspondence about household matters. She signs it. She seals it. And then she hands it not to the royal post, but to a specific servant, a woman she has trusted for years. Someone whose loyalty she has cultivated slowly and carefully. Someone who knows exactly which route to take and which hands are safe. This was not fiction. This was statecraft. And some of the most sophisticated practitioners of this particular art in all of European history were royal women who had figured out through necessity, through experience, and through a kind of political intelligence that history has consistently underestimated, that information was the only real currency that could not be taken away from them by force. Let me tell you about Catherine Parr. Most people, if they know her at all, know her as the sixth wife of Henry VIII, the one who survived, the one who is summed. Imms described a little dismissively as the nursemaid, the sensible older woman who looked after the aging king in his final years. That description is so wildly incomplete that it borders on insulting. Catherine Parr was, by the time she married Henry in 1543, one of the most educated women in England. She spoke multiple languages, Latin, French, Italian, and some Spanish, at a level that went well beyond the polite accomplishments expected of noble women. She had a genuine scholarly interest in theology, philosophy, and humanist literature. She was, by the standards of any era, an intellectual. She was also, by 1546, in serious danger. The conservative faction at Henry's court, the men who opposed the Protestant-leaning religious reforms that Catherine supported and quietly advanced, had convinced the king to sign a warrant for her arrest on charges of heresy. Henry VIII had signed similar warrants before. The women who received them did not tend to fare well, Catherine found out. And what she did next is one of the most instructive examples of political intelligence in action that I have ever encountered in historical research. She did not flee. She did not fight. She did not even, as far as the sources tell us, panic, at least not visibly. She went directly to Henry. She sat beside him. She engaged him in theological conversation. And she did something extraordinarily calculated. She framed her own views not as convictions, but as questions. She told him she had only ever raised these subjects in order to learn from him, from his great wisdom and understanding. She presented herself not as his intellectual equal, which she absolutely was, but as his grateful student. Henry, who was in significant physical pain by this point and who responded to flattery the way most of us respond to a warm bath, relaxed immediately. He declared her a perfect wife. The next day, when, what? The officers arrived to arrest her. Henry sent them away. Catherine Parr survived Henry VIII through one of the most precisely executed performances of strategic submission in recorded history. She knew exactly what this particular man needed to hear. She knew exactly how to deliver it. And she knew that her survival depended on making him feel that the threat had come from somewhere else, and that she alone, had always been safely, loyally his. What strikes me about this is not just the cleverness, it is the nerve. To know you have been marked, to know the warrant exists, and to walk calmly into the room with the man who signed it and talk him out of his own decision. That is not luck, that is preparation. Years of watching, listening, understanding how this particular mind worked, and storing that knowledge for the moment when it would matter most. But Catherine Parr's information network went beyond her relationship with Henry. She maintained connections carefully, quietly, with reformist thinkers across England and with Protestant intellectuals in Europe. She corresponded with scholars, with clergymen, with noblewomen who shared her religious sympathies. She published books under her own name, something almost no queen consort had done before her, which served the double purpose of advancing the theological arguments she cared about and establishing herself as a figure of public intellectual standing. Why did the publishing matter from a survival standpoint? Because a woman with a public intellectual reputation was harder to simply disappear. She had an identity outside the palace walls. people knew her name who had never set foot at court. If something happened to her, people would ask questions. Catherine understood that visibility, managed correctly, was a form of protection. Now I want to take you north, considerably further north, to a story that unfolds. Considerably further north, to a story that unfolds across the border between France and Scotland, and that involves one of the most extraordinary mother-daughter pairs in 16th century European history, Marie de Guise and her daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. Marie de Guise was a French noblewoman who became Queen of Scotland by marrying King James V in 1538. When James died in 1542, their daughter Mary was 6 days old. 6 days, and already queen. Marie became regent, the ruler who governed Scotland in her infant daughter's name. And she held that position for nearly 2 decades while navigating a situation of staggering complexity. Scotland was caught between 2 enormous gravitational forces, Protestant England to the south, pulling toward religious reform and English political influence, and Catholic France to the east, where Marie's own powerful family, the Guise family, held tremendous sway. Marie de Guise managed this impossible position through a combination of diplomatic skill, physical toughness. She personally supervised military operations against English-backed Protestant forces and an information network that would be impressive by the standards of any professional intelligence operation. She maintained regular coded correspondence with the French court, with her brothers in Paris, with papal representatives, and with Scottish nobles whose loyalties she was constantly working to secure or monitor. She knew, often before her opponents did, which Scottish lords were in contact with the English. She knew which promises were being made and broken. She knew the financial pressures bearing on specific families and how those pressures might tip their allegiances. How did she know all this? Because she had spent years building relationships at every level of Scottish society, not just with the powerful, but with merchants, with clergy, with women in noble households, who moved through social networks that men in Po were tended to ignore. Women's social networks in this period were genuinely underestimated as intelligence channels. The ladies-in-waiting, the women who attended births and deaths and illnesses, the wives and daughters who moved between households, they carried information in the natural flow of their social lives. And a politically intelligent queen who paid attention to these networks, who cultivated these relationships, who was genuinely kind and remembered details about people's lives. She had access to a constant low-level flow of information that no formal intelligence service could replicate. Marie de Guise died in 1560 from what was likely severe edema, fluid accumulation brought on by years of physical stress and illness. She died in Edinburgh Castle, still fighting for her daughter's throne, in a situation that had become militarily untenable. She did not win in the end. But she held Scotland together for nearly 20 years against forces that should have overwhelmed her in the first 5. And she had prepared her daughter Mary with something invaluable, a genuine understanding of how to build and maintain networks of trust, how to read people, how to move information. Whether Mary used those lessons as well as her mother had given them that is a longer and sadder story for another time. Let me shift the geography one more time, because I think this particular piece of the puzzle becomes richest when you see how universal it was. The Kingdom of Navarre in the 1560s was ruled by a queen named Jeanne d'Albret. Jeanne was the mother of the man who would eventually become Henry IV of France, the founder of the Bourbon dynasty. She was also, in her own right, one of the most determined Protestant advocates in 16th century Europe, ruling a small but strategically significant kingdom wedged between France and Spain. Both France and Spain wanted to absorb the Navarre. Both France and Spain were Catholic powers that viewed Jeanne's Protestantism as both a religious affront and a convenient excuse for intervention. Jeanne's response was to become essentially her own intelligence service. She cultivated contacts within the French Huguenot community, the French Protestant minority that stretched across the entire country. She maintained correspondence with Protestant leaders in Geneva, in England, in the German states. She knew the internal politics of the French court, with a granularity that would have surprised people who assumed a small kingdom's queen was operating with limited information. And she used this knowledge tactically. She knew when to push and when to stay quiet. She knew which French nobles were sympathetic to the Huguenot cause and could be approached, and which ones were informants for the Catholic faction. She negotiated from a position of apparent weakness that was in fact considerably stronger than it appeared, because she almost always knew more than the people across the table thought she knew. There is a record of a conversation between Jeanne and Catherine de' Medici, the French Queen Mother, who was herself one of the era's most formidable political operators, in which Catherine apparently made a proposal that she assumed Jeanne would find attractive. Jeanne declined politely, but immediately, Catherine was reportedly surprised. She had expected negotiation. What she did not know was that Jeanne had already received intelligence suggesting the proposal was a trap, a preliminary step in a larger plan to compromise Navarre's independence. She declined because she already knew what the offer really was. That is what a well-maintained information network buys you, not just knowledge, the ability to see moves before they are made. So why does this matter? Why am I spending so much time on letters and and social networks? Because I think it challenges something fundamental about how we have been taught to see these women. The popular narrative, and I am going to be a little blunt here, is that royal women of this period were largely reactive, that they were shaped by the decisions of the men around them, and that their own choices were primarily about how to respond to whatever situation they found themselves. But the picture that emerges when you actually look closely at the historical record is quite different. The women who survived, who truly survived and did more than merely survive, were not reactive. They were proactive. They were building continuously the resources and the relationships and the knowledge that they would need for situations they could not yet fully predict, but absolutely knew might come. They were playing chess while the people around them thought they were playing a much simpler game, and the board they were playing on was made not of marble or gold or military force. It was made of trust, loyalty, information, the quiet accumulation of obligations and relationships, and knowledge that no one could simply take away at sword point. And here is what I find most remarkable about all of this. Honestly, remarkable, not just as a rhetorical device. None of these women had formal training in intelligence or statecraft. There were no schools for this. There were no manuals. Everything they did, they developed through observation, intuition, and the hard experience of watching what happened to women who did not do it. They learned from each other, from older women who had navigated the same waters before them, from mothers and aunts and ladies-in-waiting who had survived their own versions of the game. Knowledge passed between women, often in the private spaces of the court, in the bedchamber, in the garden, over needlework. That was never writ. 10 down in any official record, because no one with official power thought those conversations were worth recording. But the conversations happened, and they mattered enormously. The women who figured this out built something that transcended any individual marriage or reign. They built a tradition, a quiet, largely invisible, deeply sophisticated tradition of mutual support and shared knowledge that helped generations of royal women navigate situations that would otherwise have been unsurvivable. Which raises a question that genuinely keeps me up at night when I think about this history. How much of what we call women's intuition, that supposedly mysterious ability to read rooms and people and situations that women are often credited with in a slightly patronizing way, is actually the product of generations of accumulated, hard-won intelligence about how to survive in environments where formal power was denied to you. I do not have a definitive answer, but I find the question impossible to let go of. There is one more layer to this that we have not touched yet, and it connects directly to where we are going next. The information networks were essential. The diplomatic skills were essential. The ability to read people and situations, absolutely essential. But there was something else that the shrewdest royal women understood about survival. Something that had to do not with intelligence gathering, but with the body itself, with the one biological reality that gave them both their greatest vulnerability and, paradoxically, their most powerful tool, the question of the heir. The pregnancy game, as I sometimes think of it privately, was perhaps the most complex and most dangerous calculation a royal woman ever had to make. And the women who played it most skillfully did things that honestly still astonish me when I read about them. That is what we are going to step into next, and I will warn you, it is going to be more complicated, more human, and more surprising than you might expect. Of all the pressures a royal woman carried on her shoulders, and by now you have a fairly vivid sense of just how many there were, none was more immediate, more personal, or more relentless than this one. The question of the heir. It followed her into the bedchamber and out of it. It followed her through miscarriages and stillbirths, and the fragile hope of every new pregnancy. It was the lens through which her entire value as a person was assessed, month after month, year after year, by a court that never stopped watching and never stopped calculating. And yet, and this is the part that history rarely pauses to examine properly, some of these women found ways to use that pressure, to shape it, to turn the very thing that made them most vulnerable into something that gave them at least temporarily a measure of safety or influence or time. The pregnancy game, as I have come to think of it, was one of the most psychologically complex dimensions of royal marriage, and the women who navigated it most skillfully were doing something extraordinarily difficult, managing their own bodies, their own grief, their own fear, while simultaneously playing a political role in which every outcome carried enormous consequence. Let us talk about what that actually looked like. Start with the mathematics, because the mathematics alone are staggering. Eleanor of Castile, who was the wife of Edward I of England, was pregnant at least 16 times over the course of their marriage. 16. She and Edward married in 1254 when she was around 13 years old. We touched on betrothal ages in an earlier part of this series, so you already know that was not unusual for the time. What is remarkable is what followed. Over the next 36 years, Eleanor bore her husband somewhere between 14 and 16 children. Historians debate the exact number because infant mortality was so high that some births left almost no documentary trace. Of all those children, only 6 survived to adulthood. Of those 6, only one son made it to adulthood, and he died before his father, leaving Edward's second marriage to produce the heir who eventually became Edward II. 16 pregnancies, a lifetime of physical endurance, and a marriage that was, by the standards of the era, genuinely affectionate. Edward was reportedly devastated when Eleanor died in 1290, and the Eleanor Crosses, the series of monuments he erected at each place, her funeral procession stopped on the way to London, still partially survive today. But here's what I want you to hold on to from Eleanor's story. She understood intuitively and early that frequent pregnancy was not just a biological reality. It was a form of political currency. A visibly pregnant queen was a queen who was fulfilling her primary function. She was not to be removed, not to be threatened, not to be replaced. She was necessary. She was producing the next generation of the dynasty. This sounds almost mercenary when I put it that way, and I do not mean it to. Eleanor's pregnancies were also clearly the product of a genuine partnership, but the political dimension was real, and any woman in her position who ignored it was ignoring one of the few forms of leverage available to her. Now let us look at what happened when that leverage disappeared. Mary I of England, the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, the first woman to rule England in her own right, married Philip II of Spain in 1554. She was 38 years old, which was considered quite late for her first marriage in the 16th century, and she desperately wanted a child, partly for dynastic reasons, partly by all accounts, because she genuinely longed for a family. In the autumn of 1554, Mary announced that she was pregnant. The court celebrated. Preparations began for the birth. Cradles were made. Nurseries were prepared. The news spread across Europe. And then, nothing. By the summer of 1555, Mary had been awaiting delivery for months beyond what any normal pregnancy timeline would suggest. Physicians were baffled, the court grew quiet, and eventually, the terrible truth became undeniable. There was no baby. What Mary experienced is now understood by medical historians to have been a phantom pregnancy, to have been a phantom pregnancy, a condition in which the body produces all the hormonal and physical signs of pregnancy, including an enlarged abdomen, cessation of menstruation, and even what feels like fetal movement, without an actual pregnancy being present. It can be triggered by extreme psychological desire, combined with significant hormonal imbalance. Mary had wanted a child so profoundly, and her body had been under such intense stress, that her own physiology had deceived her completely. The political and personal fallout was devastating. Philip, who had been largely indifferent to the marriage from the beginning, he was 11 years younger than Mary, and had married her primarily for strategic reasons, left England shortly after. He would return only once, briefly, when he needed English military support. Mary was left alone, politically weakened, publicly humiliated by a situation that was entirely beyond her control. She experienced what appears to have been a second phantom pregnancy in 1557, which if anything made the situation worse. She died in 1558 at 42 years old, having never had a child. The cruelty of Mary's story is that she was punished by history, by her contemporaries, by the trajectory of her reign, for a biological reality that she had no power over. Her inability to produce an heir was not a failure of Shah, actor, or intelligence or effort. It was the result of physical conditions that no one in the 16th century understood, and that she had no means to address. And yet the consequences were as severe as if she had simply refused. Let us turn to a story with a different shape, because if Mary's experience represents the tragedy of the pregnancy game when it goes wrong, Catherine de' Medici represents something almost its opposite, the strange redemption that sometimes came when it finally went right. Catherine de' Medici arrived in France in 1533 as the 14-year-old bride of Henry, Duke of Orleans, the second son of the French king, which meant she was not even marrying the heir, let alone the king himself. Her position at the French court was precarious from the beginning. She was Italian in a court that looked down on Italians. She was a Medici, a banking family, however powerful, in a world that prized ancient noble lineage. And almost immediately, she was overshadowed by her husband's long-standing relationship with Diane de Poitiers, a French noblewoman nearly 20 years Henry's senior, who held a degree of emotional influence over him that Catherine could not match. And then the years began to pass. 1 year of marriage, no child. 3 years, no child. 5 years, still nothing. By the 10th year of their marriage, Catherine had not produced a single pregnancy. In an era when infertility was assumed to be the woman's fault, always automatically, regardless of any evidence to the contrary, she was in serious danger of being set aside. The whispers at court grew louder. Henry's advisors began raising the question of annulment. Catherine, by multiple historical accounts, was acutely aware of her position. She reportedly sought out physicians, herbalists, and every form of medical advice available to her. She prayed. She wore amulets. She tried remedies that sound bizarre to modern ears but represented the best available medical knowledge of the time. And then, in 1544, 11 years into the marriage, she gave birth to her first child, a son. Over the next 12 years, she had 9 more children, 10 children in total. What changed? Historians and medical researchers have speculated for centuries. Some suggest a physical condition corrected itself. Some point to the possibility that Diane de Poitiers, perhaps recognizing that Catherine's removal would create political instability, actually encouraged Henry to spend more time with his wife. There is a remarkable document, possibly apocryphal, but repeated in multiple sources, suggesting that Diane herself advised Henry on this point. Whatever the reason, the years of waiting ended. And when they did, Catherine's position transformed completely. A queen with children is a different political entity from a queen without them. She had heirs to protect. She had a future to secure. She had leverage. And Catherine de' Medici, patient, watchful, politically intelligent Catherine, who had spent 11 years at the French court, learning everything about everyone, while appearing to be merely a quiet, childless wife, was ready to use every bit of it. She would eventually become one of the most powerful figures in 16th century France, serving as regent during the reigns of 3 of her sons. She shaped French foreign policy, navigated the wars of religion, and left a mark on European history that lasted for generations. All of it built on those 11 years of waiting, of watching, of learning, of surviving something that would have broken many people, and coming out the other side not just intact, but formidably prepared. I want to pause here and say something that I think needs saying. When we look at these stories, Mary's phantom pregnancies, Catherine's decade of childlessness, Eleanor's 16 pregnancies, it is very easy to analyze them as political events, as pieces in a larger strategic puzzle. But they were also deeply, profoundly human experiences. These were real women feeling real loss, real grief, real desperation, real longing. A miscarriage is not a political setback. It is a loss. And these women experienced those losses in the most public possible way, surrounded by people who were watching not with compassion, but with calculation, assessing what this miscarriage meant for the succession, for the king's patience, for the queen's security of tenure, the fact that so many of them kept going, kept trying, kept functioning, kept engaging with the political demands of their position in the face of repeated grief and physical trauma and public scrutiny is something that I find genuinely moving. It is also, I think, one of the least acknowledged forms of courage in all of women's history. Now something that does not get talked about nearly enough. The women who had successfully produced heirs, and especially those who had produced multiple surviving children, did something very deliberate with that achievement. They built from it. A queen with a living son was a queen with a constituency. The nobles who expected to flourish under the next reign had a reason to support her. The ambassadors of foreign powers who maintained relationships with the heir had a reason to maintain relationships with his mother. The church, which had baptized and blessed these children, had a kind of ceremonial investment in the family's stability. The son was not just a successor. He was a political asset that transformed his mother's position within the court. And the shrewdest queens understood this and planned accordingly. They invested in their children's education with the same strategic intentionality that they brought to their correspondence and their alliances. They chose tutors carefully. They supervised the formation of their children's households. They maintained close relationships with the people who surrounded their children, because those people would eventually surround the next king or queen. And a mother who had shaped those relationships early had a form of influence that would extend well beyond her own reign. This is something Margaret Beaufort, whom we met in an earlier part of this series, understood with particular clarity. Her entire adult life, after the traumatic birth of her son Henry, was oriented around his survival and eventual triumph. And when that triumph came, when Henry Tudor became Henry VII, Margaret was there right at the center of the new court, with decades of carefully maintained relationships and accumulated political intelligence ready to deploy. Her son became king, but the foundation on which his kingship rested had been built brick by brick over 30 years by his mother. And yet, and I think this is the part that genuinely complicates any simple narrative about the pregnancy game, producing an heir was not always the protection it seemed, because a son could grow into a rival. A queen who had successfully positioned herself through her children could find, as those children matured and began to form their own political identities and their own circles of advisors, that the assets she had spent decades building had developed interests of its own that did not necessarily align with hers. This is one of the deepest ironies of the royal mother's position. She needed her children to survive and thrive. Her entire safety depended on it. But the more fully they thrived, the less they needed her, and sometimes the less they wanted her. The transition from invaluable mother of the heir to politically inconvenient dowager queen is one of the sharp edges in royal women's history that very few people talk about. We will get there. There is a whole chapter of this story still ahead of us that deals with exactly this transition and what the women who navigated it most successfully did differently from those who did not. But before we get there, there is something else I want to explore, something that sat alongside the pregnancy question in every royal court across Europe, running as a quiet undercurrent beneath all the diplomatic maneuvering and political calculation. The question of physical safety, not the grand political dangers we have been discussing. Something more immediate, more intimate. The food on the table, the wine in the cup. The people who prepared them and whose hands they passed through before they reached the queen. Because in a world where chemistry was poorly understood, but deeply feared, where a skilled practitioner could produce effects that looked entirely natural, where there was no reliable way to distinguish illness from intervention. The question of what a royal woman ate and drank was never a simple matter of hunger or thirst. It was a matter of survival, and the lengths to which some queens went to protect themselves at the table, and the ways in which others failed to do so, is one of the most quietly gripping chapters we have yet to explore. That is where we are headed next. Imagine sitting down to dinner and knowing, not suspecting, not worrying, but genuinely knowing that someone at that table might wish you dead. Not in a vague existential sense, in a very specific, very practical sense. Someone who had access to your kitchen, someone who knew your habits, someone who understood that in a world without forensic science, without toxicology reports, without any reliable way to distinguish a sudden illness from a deliberate one, the right substance in the right amount left, almost no trace that anyone at the time could identify with certainty. This was the reality that royal women lived with, every meal, every cup of wine, every sweet offered by a smiling courtier at a banquet where the candles flickered and the music played and everything looked on the surface perfectly civilized. And the ways they responded to that reality, the systems they built, the habits they cultivated, the almost obsessive attention they paid to the movement of food between the kitchen and their lips, reveals something fascinating about the texture of daily life at the highest levels of medieval and early modern power. Let us start with the landscape, because context matters enormously here. The medieval and Renaissance periods had a complicated, almost mythological relationship with what we might loosely call chemical harm. The knowledge of which plants and minerals produce dangerous effects had existed for centuries. It was embedded in medical tradition, in herbalism, in the practical knowledge of apothecaries and physicians, and wise women who worked with plants every day. Arsenic was known. It was tasteless, odorless, and in small doses produced symptoms, fever, digestive distress, gradual weakness, that looked almost identical to any number of natural illnesses. It was grimly, so commonly associated with inheritance disputes in Italian noble families that it acquired the nickname inheritance powder in some historical accounts. Lead. Compounds were used in cosmetics and sometimes found their way into food preparation through contaminated vessels. Various plant extracts, some derived from species like belladonna or hemlock or the deadly nightshade family, were available to anyone with sufficient botanical knowledge. And in a world where a royal woman who died inconveniently was often more useful to certain factions than a royal woman who lived inconveniently, the temptation to reach for these methods was, unfortunately, real. Now, and I want to be careful here, because historical accuracy matters, most deaths at royal courts were exactly what they appeared to be. Natural illness, infections that modern medicine would handle in an afternoon, but that could kill within days in an era before antibiotics. Childbirth complications. The accumulated physical toll of hard living in bodies that were not, despite the palaces and the feasts, necessarily well-nourished or well-rested. But the perception of danger was itself a political reality. Whether or not a specific death was deliberately caused, the possibility existed. Everyone knew it existed, and that knowledge shaped behavior in ways that were profound and lasting. The most visible institutional response to this reality was the taster. Every major royal court in Europe from at least the 12th century onward employed individuals whose specific function was to consume a portion of the monarch's food and drink before it reached the royal table. If the taster fell ill or worse, the dish was removed. This sounds straightforward. It was not, because the taster system, while genuinely useful in some scenarios, had significant limitations that anyone paying close attention quickly recognized. First, a taster could only identify substances that acted quickly. Arsenic in small doses administered consistently over weeks or months would produce effects long after any single tasted meal could be implicated. The taster might consume a tiny quantity every day for a month without showing any acute symptoms, while the queen, consuming a slightly larger quantity through every meal, experienced a slow, systematic decline in health. Second, the taste. Her system depended entirely on the loyalty and incorruptibility of everyone involved in food preparation, from the kitchen staff to the serving attendants to the taster themselves. A sufficiently motivated actor who had access to the food after tasting, or who could bribe or compromise the taster, could circumvent the entire system. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the taster protected against threats introduced into the food. It did nothing about the cup, the serving vessels, the gloves that handled the bread, or any of the dozen other points of contact between preparation and consumption. The queens who took their own safety seriously understood all of this, and they developed responses that went considerably beyond simply employing a taster and assuming the problem was solved. Bona Sforza is a name that deserves far more recognition than it typically receives outside of Polish historical circles. She was an Italian noblewoman, the daughter of the Duke of Milan, who became Queen of Poland by marrying Sigismund II in 1518. She brought with her from Italy not only a sophisticated political education and a forceful personality, but a set of cultural practices around food safety that were considerably more developed than what she found at the Polish court. Bona was, by multiple historical accounts, almost obsessive about the provenance and preparation of her food. She maintained a network of trusted servants, specifically Italian servants she had brought from home, whose loyalty she had reason to believe was to her personally, rather than to any Polish faction who oversaw her kitchen. She insisted on knowing where ingredients came from. She was reportedly suspicious of gifts of food from courtiers, which was a common form of flattery at the time, but also obviously a potential vector for tampering. She developed a practice of rotating the servants who handled her food, so that no single person had consistent, predictable access to her meals over a long period. Was this paranoia? Perhaps, by some lights. But Bona Sforza lived to 73 years old. Extraordinarily old for the 16th century, and died in Italy, having outlasted her husband and returned to her homeland after decades of navigating the complex and frequently treacherous politics of the Polish court. Whether her careful habits contributed to her longevity, we cannot say with certainty, but she clearly believed they did, and the historical record does not contradict her. There is also a darker chapter to Bona's story that I want to handle carefully, because the historical evidence is genuinely contested. When Bona returned to Italy in her final years, she died in 1557, under circumstances that her contemporaries found suspicious. Some historical accounts suggest she was in contact with Philip II of Spain over financial matters. She had lent enormous sums to the Spanish crown, and that there were people who stood to benefit from those debts dying with her. Whether what happened to Bona at the end of her life was natural or otherwise, we genuinely cannot say. What I find poignant about it is this: a woman who spent decades being careful, who built systems and habits and safeguards, who had, by every reasonable measure, earned a peaceful old age, still ended her life under a cloud of uncertainty that history has never fully resolved. It is a reminder that no system is perfect, and that the danger these women faced was never entirely preventable, only at best manageable. Now, let me tell you about someone whose name you probably know, but not for the reasons history actually warrants. Lucrezia Borgia. If you have encountered that name before, you have almost certainly encountered it attached to words like poisoner and femme fatale, and possibly a hollow ring that supposedly concealed deadly substances for dropping into enemies' wine glasses. I want to spend a moment on this. Because the Lucrezia Borgia of popular imagination and the Lucrezia Borgia of historical record are two completely different women, and the gap between them tells us something important about how history has treated royal women who were caught in the crossfire of powerful men's ambitions. Lucrezia was the daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, and the sister of Cesare Borgia, one of the most ruthlessly ambitious military and political operators of the Italian Renaissance. She was used by both of them as a diplomatic piece, married 3 times before she was 22. Each marriage arranged to serve her family's shifting political interests. The Borgia family did have genuine enemies. Rodrigo and Cesare were involved in political intrigues that resulted in real harm to real people. But the specific accusations against Lucrezia that she was personally involved in harming others, that she carried poison in her ring, that she was an active participant in her family's schemes, have been examined by historians for centuries and have consistently failed to produce credible contemporary evidence. What the historical record actually shows is a woman who was moved from marriage to marriage, according to her father and brother's needs, who had almost no control over any of it, and who eventually, in her 3rd marriage to Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, built something resembling a genuine life of her own. At the court of Ferrara, Lucrezia became a noted patron of arts and literature. She corresponded with poets, including the famous Pietro Bembo, whose letters to her were literary works in their own right. She administered the duchy capably during her husband's absences. She raised her children. She engaged seriously with religion in her later years. She died in 1519 at 39 years old from complications following the birth of her 8th child. The poison ring, as far as historians can determine, never existed. What did exist was a woman who spent most of her youth being used as a pawn by powerful men, and who then spent her adult years quietly building the stable, cultured, relatively peaceful life that her early years had denied her. The transformation of Lucrezia Borgia into history's most famous poisoner is one of the more vivid examples of how accusations, particularly accusations touching on the specific fears people had about women and domestic spaces and food, could attach themselves to a woman's reputation and prove almost impossible to dislodge even centuries later. But let us come back to the practical reality of poison as a threat, because the fear was not baseless, even if many specific accusations were. The courts that took food safety most seriously developed layered systems of protection that went well beyond the taster. At the court of the Holy Roman Emperors in the 15th and 16th centuries, the service of food to the empress involved a ritualized sequence with multiple checkpoints. The silver vessels used were themselves considered a form of protection. Silver was believed to tarnish in the presence of certain substances, which was not entirely mythological, since some silver compounds do react to certain chemicals. Whether this actually provided reliable detection is another question, but the belief was genuine and widely held. Queens maintained what we might call a trusted inner circle of serving women whose primary function was to be the human link between the kitchen and the table. These were not random appointments. They were women who had been with the queen for years, often since childhood, whose families were known, whose loyalty had been tested repeatedly. They ate with the queen, served the queen, and were in the most direct possible sense the last line of protection between the queen and whatever the kitchen had produced. Joanna of Austria, who became Queen of Spain by marrying Philip II, maintained a household staff that was notable for its stability. The same women who had come with her from Vienna remained in her service for years. A deliberate choice in a court where rapid staff turnover was both common and, from a safety perspective, concerning. People you had known for a decade were people whose behavior you could read. A new face in the kitchen was a question mark. Here is something I find genuinely interesting to think about, and I am curious whether this resonates with you. The protective systems these queens built around their food and their households were at their core systems of trust. They could not test every dish chemically. They could not be present at every stage of food preparation. What they could do was build networks of people whose trustworthiness they had reason to believe in, and maintain those networks with the same care and intentionality that they brought to their diplomatic correspondence and their political alliances. In other words, the solution to physical vulnerability was fundamentally the same solution these women applied to political vulnerability: relationships. Carefully chosen, deliberately cultivated, consistently maintained over long periods of time. A queen who was kind to her servants, genuinely kind, not performatively kind, who remembered names and noticed illnesses and took an interest in the families of the people who served her, was a queen whose household was harder to penetrate and corrupt, not impossible, but harder. And that, when you think about it, is a remarkably sophisticated security strategy. For a world that had no other tools available, the fear of harm through food also shaped something else at Roy. Our courts that people rarely discussed. The physical geography of power. Royal women who were anxious about their safety became, over time, very particular about their physical spaces. Who could enter them? How many people had access to which rooms? Where food was prepared? And by whom? And under what supervision? This physical wariness was not irrational. It was the product of clear-eyed assessment of real conditions, and it shaped the architecture of the inner chambers, the privy chambers, the bedchambers, the private dining rooms, in ways that were simultaneously about comfort and about control. The women who managed these spaces most deliberately were in effect creating small territories of safety within the larger, more unpredictable territory of the court. Spaces where the rules were theirs to set, where access was controlled by her people according to her criteria. The bedchamber, for all that it is usually discussed in terms of intimacy and reproduction, was also in the hands of a politically aware queen, a carefully managed security zone. And yet, for all the precautions, for all the systems and the trusted servants and the silver vessels and the layered protocols, some queens still fell ill in ways that their contemporaries could not explain, and that history has never fully resolved. These ambiguous cases are in some ways the most haunting part of this story. Not because we can say with certainty that something deliberate occurred, we cannot, but because the uncertainty itself, the impossibility of ever fully knowing, was part of the lived experience of these women. They moved through their days in the knowledge that some threats were invisible, that some dangers could not be planned against no matter how careful you were. That kind of sustained uncertainty does something to a person. It sharpens certain instincts. It creates, over time, a particular quality, tie of attention, a way of being present in a room, of reading the people in it, of noticing small things that others might overlook. I sometimes think that what we read in the historical record as these women's political shrewdness, their ability to read situations, to anticipate, to notice, was partly the product of this. Of years spent paying close attention because close attention was a matter of physical survival. Hypervigilance in a context where vigilance was genuinely warranted. Which brings us naturally to something that operated alongside all of these physical and practical strategies, something more intangible but no less real in the lives of these women. Faith. Not faith in the vague decorative sense that we sometimes see attached to historical women as a kind of polite shorthand for passivity. Genuine, active, politically sophisticated faith. Genuine, active, politically sophisticated faith. Used in ways that were sometimes profoundly strategic, sometimes deeply personal, and sometimes so intertwined that even the women themselves might not have been able to separate the two, because the church and the specific ways that royal women positioned themselves within it turn out to be one of the most fascinating and underexplored survival strategies in this entire series. And the story of how some of these women used religious identity as both shield and sword is honestly one of the things I have been most looking forward to sharing with you. That is exactly where we are going next. Faith in the medieval world was not a private matter. It was not something you kept tucked quietly inside yourself, between you and whatever you believed in. It was visible, it was performed. It was read by everyone around you as a signal about your character, your loyalties, your trustworthiness, your place in the social and cosmic order. And royal women, who were under more scrutiny than almost anyone else alive, whose every jest. Europe was observed and interpreted, and reported understood this with a clarity that could be almost surgical. The most politically aware among them did not simply practice faith. They curated it, they shaped it, they projected it with the same deliberate intentionality that a modern public figure might bring to managing their image, except the stakes were considerably higher, and the audience included not just the court but the church, foreign powers, and ordinary people whose goodwill could, in the right circumstances, become a form of protection. The religious shield, as I think of it, was one of the most sophisticated survival tools available to a royal woman in this era, and the women who wielded it most effectively did something that deserves genuine admiration. They found a way to be authentically devout and strategically brilliant at the same time, without either dimension undermining the other. Let me introduce you to someone who mastered this particular art, perhaps more completely than anyone else in medieval European history. Blanche of Castile. She was born in 1188, the daughter of Alfonso VIII of Castile and Eleanor of England, who was herself the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women of the 12th century. So Blanche came from extraordinary stock, but what she built from that foundation was entirely her own. She married Louis VIII of France in 1200 at age 12, as part of a diplomatic settlement between England and France. Standard for the era, as you now know very well. What was not standard was what she did with the next 4 decades of her life. When her husband died in 1226, her son Louis, the future Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis, was only 12 years old. Blanche became regent of France, and she governed with complete authority for the next 8 years until her son came of age. This was not quietly accepted by the French nobility. Several powerful barons formed coalitions against her, arguing with barely concealed contempt that it was inappropriate for a woman, and a foreign-born woman at that, to govern France. Blanche's response was not to argue the point on political grounds. She was too smart for that. Instead, she wrapped herself so thoroughly in the language and imagery of religious duty that attacking her became effectively an attack on God's chosen order. She was visibly, extravagantly pious. She attended Mass multiple times daily. She gave generously to religious houses and charitable institutions. She cultivated close relationships with leading churchmen, not as personal friendships exactly, but as a form of institutional alliance. When the bishops and abbots of France were seen to support her governance, it became considerably more difficult for secular lords to oppose her without appearing to oppose the church as well. She also used her son's evident holiness. Louis was genuinely devout, which was not something she manufactured but absolutely something she encouraged and made visible as a reflection of her own godly character. A woman who had raised a saint could not easily be dismissed as an illegitimate ruler. Did the rebellious barons still cause trouble? Yes, repeatedly. But Blanche held the regency, suppressed the rebellions, governed effectively, and handed her son a stable kingdom when he came of age. She then served as regent again when Louis left on crusade, governing France a second time from 1248 until her death in 1252. She governed France in total for more than a decade, and she did it using faith as the central pillar of her political legitimacy. Now, something I want to be honest about here because I think it matters. There is a real question about how to read the religious devotion of these women. Were they genuinely faithful, or were they performing faith strategically? And the honest answer is almost certainly both, in proportions that varied by individual and by moment. The two things are not mutually exclusive. A person can hold genuine heartfelt beliefs and also understand that those beliefs expressed in certain ways serve their interests. That is not hypocrisy. That is the ordinary human condition where our inner lives and our social presentations are never perfectly separate. What I find most interesting is not whether these women were really religious. Most of them clearly were by any reasonable measure. But how they chose to express that faith and what forms of expression they chose to make most visible. Because those choices were not accidental. The patronage of religious institutions was one of the most powerful tools available to a royal woman with resources and intention. When a queen endowed a monastery or a convent or a hospital or a school attached to a church, she was doing several things simultaneously. She was performing visible piety, which we have already discussed. She was creating a physical space over which she had a degree of authority that was recognized by the church and which secular lords had limited ability to interfere with. She was building a community of people, nuns, monks, priests, administrators, the lay workers who served religious houses, whose livelihoods were connected to her generosity, and who therefore had reason to pray for her, speak well of her, and maintain loyalty to her memory even after her death. And she was, in some cases, creating a physical refuge, a place she could go, and sometimes a place she could send people she wanted to protect, that existed outside the immediate reach of hostile court factions. Hedwig of Silesia, a 13th century duchess who was later canonized, is an instructive example of how this worked in practice. Hedwig came free, from the noble Landex family, and married Henry I of Silesia, becoming Duchess of a territory that was politically contested and frequently under military pressure. Over the course of her marriage, Hedwig founded and endowed numerous religious institutions, most significantly the Cistercian convent at Trebnitz, which became one of the most important religious houses in the region. This was not simply generosity. Trebnitz gave Hedwig a community of educated women. The nuns were required to be literate, which was unusual for the time, who produced manuscripts, maintained records, educated daughters of noble families, and served as a kind of cultural anchor for the region. Hedwig maintained a close relationship with the convent throughout her life, and after her husband's death essentially retired there. She died at Trebnitz in 1243, surrounded by the community she had built, having outlasted decades of political turbulence through a combination of genuine faith, strategic generosity, and the cultivation of relationships that transcended the purely secular world of her husband's court. The church, in effect, had given her a territory of her own, one that no baron could simply seize. There is another dimension of the religious shield that is less discussed but equally important: the concept of sanctuary. In medieval Europe, churches and religious institutions held a legally recognized status as places of refuge. Someone who reached a church could claim sanctuary, and secular authorities, in theory at least, were required to respect it. The rules around sanctuary were complicated and varied by time and place, but the basic principle held enough weight in the culture and the law that it genuinely constrained what powerful men could do in physical proximity to sacred space. For royal women in danger, this mattered. Not because they could simply run to the nearest church every time things got difficult. That would be neither practical nor politically viable, but because the existence of sacred space as a form of protected territory shaped the geography of the court in ways that gave women a resource. The Queen's Chapel in many royal palaces was a space that she controlled and that carried a degree of religious sanctity. The presence of her chaplains, men who answered to her, who were part of her household, who had direct access to her, gave her a communication channel that was somewhat less vulnerable to interception than other forms of correspondence. Confessional confidentiality was, in theory, absolute. In practice, confessors were sometimes pressured or compromised, but the principle provided at least a partial shield. Let me tell you about Isabella of Portugal. Because her story illustrates something I find deeply moving about how faith and political intelligence could be so thoroughly integrated that separating them becomes almost impossible. Isabella was the wife of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the same Charles who was Catherine of Aragon's nephew, and who wielded more political power than almost any other single person in 16th century Europe. She married Charles in 1526 and served as regent of Spain during his frequent absences, which were considerable since Charles governed an empire that stretched across Europe and into the Americas, and he spent much of his reign traveling between its parts. Isabella was, by every historical account, exceptionally capable as a regent. She managed the Spanish bureaucracy, handled diplomatic correspondence, maintained relationships with the Spanish church and nobility, and did all of this in a court that was not always entirely comfortable with a Portuguese-born woman holding such authority. Her faith was, by all indications, entirely genuine. She was notably generous to charitable institutions, personally attentive to the sick and poor in ways that went beyond what was required by her public role, and deeply invested in the spiritual education of her children. But her faith also served her politically in ways that were precise and effective in a court that was navigating the early tremors of the Reformation. The period when Martin Luther's challenges to Rome were beginning to fracture European Christianity. Isabella positioned herself and her household as unambiguously, solidly Orthodox Catholic, not in a harsh or persecutory way, but in a way that was visible and consistent. Her chapel was a center of serious, dignified worship. Her chaplains were learned, respectable men. This positioning made her trustworthy to the Spanish church and to the conservative elements of the Spanish nobility in a way that her foreign birth and her gender might otherwise have undermined. Her faith, in other words, compensated for the things about her that made people uneasy. It gave them a framework within which she was reassuringly legible. She was a pious Christian queen. That was a category they knew how to respect. She died in 1539, at 35 years old, from complications following a difficult pregnancy. Charles, by multiple historical accounts, was devastated. He wore black for the rest of his life. She had been his partner in the fullest sense, intellectually, politically, personally, and she had navigated one of the most demanding political environments in Europe with a combination of genuine faith and remarkable practical intelligence. Now, I promised you that the religious shield had two edges. That faith could cut in both directions, and I want to spend a moment on the cases where it did, because honesty demands it, and because those cases illuminate something important about the limits of any survival strategy. The most obvious example is someone we have encountered before in this series, so I will not dwell on her at length, but Mary, Queen of Scots. Her Catholicism in a country moving rapidly toward Protestantism became not a shield, but a target. Her faith was genuine. It was also, in the political context of 16th century Scotland and England, the single thing that made her most threatening to the Protestant establishment, and therefore most vulnerable to its hostility. A religious identity that aligns with powerful institutions is a resource. A religious identity that puts you at odds with the currently dominant power is a liability. The women who navigated this most successfully were those who understood the difference and positioned themselves accordingly, or who found ways to frame their faith in terms that minimized its divisive aspects while preserving what was genuinely important to them. This required a very delicate kind of sensitivity, an awareness of the religious landscape that went beyond personal conviction into something closer to geopolitical analysis. Some women had it naturally, others learned it through painful experience, and a few through stubbornness or circumstance, or simply the impossibility of their situation, could not find a position that protected them. But even in those cases, there is something worth noting. The women who chose to maintain their religious identity under pressure, who refused to renounce their faith even when doing so might have made their lives easier, were making a choice, a costly one, sometimes a fatal one, but a choice that expressed something about who they were that they valued more than safety. Whether we call that courage, or stubbornness, or something else, entirely probably depends on where we are standing. But I think it deserves to be recognized as what it was, a decision made with full knowledge of the consequences, by women who were not simply passive in the face of their circumstances, even when those circumstances were impossible. There is a thread running through all of this, through the spy networks and the food systems and the religious patronage and every other strategy we have examined, that I keep coming back to. These women were, in every case, working with what they had. They did not have armies, in most cases. They did not have the legal authority to govern in their own right. They did not have the institutional backing of states or parliaments or official positions of power. What they had was intelligence, relationships, patience, and the ability to read the world they were living in with extraordinary accuracy. And they used those things to build something that I think we have not yet fully named in this series, something that was, in a sense, the most important survival strategy of all. Because the women who lasted, the ones who endured across decades, who outlasted hostile husbands and political enemies, and shifting religious landscapes, were almost always the ones who had figured out something crucial about the nature of power in their world. They had figured out that formal authority and actual influence were two different things, and that while the first was mostly closed to them, the second was not. That insight, and the very specific ways it shaped how they moved and built, and planned is what we are going to unpack in the next part of this journey. And I think it is going to reframe some things you thought you already knew about how power actually worked in medieval and Renaissance Europe. Stay with me. We are just getting to the heart of it. Something shifts when a king dies. The court holds its breath. The old hierarchies tremble slightly, then reorganize around the new center of gravity. Mourning begins, sometimes genuine, sometimes spectacularly theatrical, occasionally both at once, and somewhere in tea. Palace, a woman who has spent years, sometimes decades, navigating the political currents of her husband's court, makes a set of decisions in the first hours and days after his death that will determine everything about what comes next for her. Does she weep publicly and withdraw? Does she position herself quietly near the new king, her son perhaps, or stepson? Does she begin making contact with foreign courts, reminding them that she is still here, still relevant, still connected? The transition from queen consort to queen dowager, from the wife of the king to the widow of the king, was one of the most consequential moments in any royal woman's life. And the women who handled it with intention rather than simply grief were sometimes able to do something that their years of marriage had never quite allowed. They were able, finally, to govern. I want to challenge something that most of us assume without really examining. We tend to think of widowhood, especially in a historical context, as a diminishment, the end of something, the closing of a chapter. And for many women in this period, especially those without resources or connections or children in powerful positions, that was exactly what it was. But for royal women, particularly those who had spent years carefully building the networks and relationships and knowledge we have been talking about throughout this series, widowhood could function as something almost opposite. It could be a release, not from grief. Grief is grief, and I do not want to minimize it. Many of these women genuinely mourned their husbands, even complicated husbands, even difficult marriages. Human hearts are not simple, and attachment does not require that its object be perfect. But widowhood released a royal woman from the specific political subordination of being a consort, from the constant performance of deference, from the legal and an institutional reality that everything she did, every letter she wrote, every relationship she cultivated, every room she entered, existed in the shadow of a man who held ultimate authority over her. A dowager queen, by contrast, had formal standing of her own. She controlled her dower lands, the properties assigned to her, for her lifetime, as part of her original marriage settlement. She had income independent of any new king's generosity. She had a household that was hers, not borrowed from her husband's court. And she had, if she had managed her years of marriage well, a store of relationships and knowledge, and accumulated credibility that she could now deploy on her own terms. The women who understood this, who had been preparing for this possibility all along, not morbidly, but practically, were sometimes able to construct positions of remarkable authority from what looked on the surface like loss. Margaret of Austria is someone I think about often when I consider this particular dimension of women's history. She was born in 1480, the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian VII and Mary of Burgundy. Her early life was a catalogue of the kinds of losses we have been discussing throughout this series. She was betrothed at age 3 to the future Charles VIII of France, raised at the French court, and then returned to her father in 1491 when Charles decided to marry someone else instead. She was 11 years old, already discarded by one royal arrangement. She married twice more, once to the heir of Spain, who died within months, and once to the Duke of Savoy, who died 3 years into their marriage, leaving her a widow at 24. 3 betrothals or marriages, 3 losses of different kinds. By her mid-20s, Margaret of Austria had experienced more political upheaval than most people encounter in a lifetime. And then her father did something that changed everything. He appointed her regent of the Habsburg Netherlands, the collection of wealthy, complex, commercially sophisticated territories in what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, on behalf of her young nephew, the future Charles I. Margaret governed the Netherlands from 1507 to 1515, and then again from 1519 until her death in 1530. That is, in total, nearly 20 years of actual governance of one of the most economically important regions in Europe. She was a genuine ruler, not a figurehead, not a placeholder. She negotiated treaties, including the Treaty of Cambrai in 1529, sometimes called the Lady's Peace because she negotiated it alongside Louise of Savoy representing France. Representing France, which temporarily ended a major conflict between France and the Habsburg Empire. She managed complex commercial relationships with the great trading cities of the Netherlands. She maintained correspondence with virtually every significant ruler in Europe. She collected art with an eye that rivaled any Renaissance prince. Her collection included works that would later become foundations of major European museums. And she did all of this from a position that she had reached through a series of losses that would have defeated many people. The widowhood that most observers probably saw as her final blow, childless, twice widowed, returned to her father's territory, turned out to be the condition that made her actual life possible. Because it was only when she was no longer defined by a husband's court and a husband's interest that her own extraordinary capabilities had room to operate. Louise of Savoy is worth dwelling on in her own right. Louise of Savoy is worth dwelling on in her own right, because her path to influence took a slightly different shape and illustrates something important about how the dowager position could be leveraged, even when the woman in question was not technically a dowager queen. Louise was the mother of Francis I of France, whom you may remember from an earlier part of this series in a rather unflattering context as the husband who essentially ignored Eleanor of Austria in favor of his long-term romantic interest. Louise herself had been widowed young at 19, left with 2 children and a modest territory, and had spent the years of her son's childhood methodically preparing him for what she clearly believed, with extraordinary maternal certainty, would be his destiny, the throne of France. When Francis became king in 1515, Louise's investment paid off in the most direct possible way. She became the most trusted advisor of the most powerful man in France. She served as regent twice during Francis's absences, once while he was on military campaign, and once during the more than a year he spent as a prisoner in Spain, following his capture at the Battle of Pavia in 1525. During that second regency, she essentially governed France alone, negotiating for her son's release, managing the ongoing religious tensions that were beginning to fracture the country, maintaining diplomatic relationships with powers across Europe. She was in her early 50s by this point. She had spent 30 years building toward this. The thing I find most striking about Louise of Savoy is not any single achievement, but the patience of her preparation. She had understood from the time her son was very young that her influence would ultimately flow through him, and she had invested in that relationship and that future with a consistency that is almost staggering to contemplate. She also negotiated the Lady's Peace alongside Margaret of Austria. As I mentioned a moment ago, 2 women, both operating from positions that gave them genuine authority, because they had built it carefully over decades, sitting across a table and ending a war. The document they produced held. The peace they negotiated lasted, in practical terms, several years, in a period when European peace was extraordinarily fragile. 2 women, 1 table, a war ended. Tell me again that these people were not really governing. Now, let me talk about something that complicates the dowager picture in an important way, because I promised you honesty. And honesty requires acknowledging the full shape of these situations. The dowager position was powerful, but it was also contested. A new king, particularly one who had his own ideas about policy, his own circle of advisors, his own agenda, did not always welcome a powerful dowager mother or stepmother hovering at the edges of his court. The influence that a dowager had built was influence that others sometimes wanted to dismantle, or at least redirect. The relationship between a dowager queen and the new monarch was frequently one of the most delicate and potentially volatile at any court. Too much visible influence, and she became a target, accused of overreach, of failing to yield gracefully to the new order, of clinging to power that was no longer properly hers. Too little, and she became irrelevant, losing the position she had spent decades building, dependent on the new king's goodwill for her income, her household, her physical security. threading that needle. Being present enough to matter without being visible enough to threaten required a kind of political fines that was in some ways even more demanding than anything these women had managed while their husbands were alive. Margaret of Navarre, the sister of Francis I, a remarkable intellectual and writer whose published works include a celebrated collection of stories called the Heptameron, navigated this particular challenge with characteristic elegance throughout her adult life. She was not a dowager queen in the technical sense, but she occupied a somewhat analogous position, a woman of royal say. Anding, whose influence flowed primarily through her relationship with a powerful male relative rather than through her own formal authority. She managed that position by making herself genuinely useful in ways that the king valued, while cultivating an independent intellectual and spiritual identity that gave her standing beyond the court. Her writing, her patronage of humanist scholars, her engagement with the religious reform movements of the era, these gave her a presence in European intellectual life that was entirely her own. When her relationship with Francis was warm, that presence amplified her influence. When it was strained, and it sometimes was, particularly as religious tensions in France intensified, her independent reputation gave her a foundation to stand on that did not depend entirely on royal favor. She survived. She published. She governed the small kingdom of Navarre through her husband. She corresponded with the leading thinkers of her day, and she died in 1549 at 57 years old, having left a mark on French intellectual and spiritual life that still resonates in scholarship today. So let me ask you something that I find genuinely interesting to think about. What does it tell us about the world these women were living in, about the structure of power in medieval and Renaissance Europe, that some of the most effective governance in the historical record was carried out by women who were technically widows or mothers of kings or sisters of kings? Women operating from positions that were defined by their relationship to male power rather than by any formal authority of their own. What does it tell us that Margaret of Austria's decades of governance were possible precisely because she was not a wife, because she had been returned to her family sphere and was operating as a Habsburg administrator rather than as someone else's consort? To me, this suggests something both hopeful and a little heartbreaking about the nature of formal power versus actual capability. The formal structures of medieval and early modern Europe were, with very few exceptions, designed to exclude women from positions of direct authority. The laws, the customs, the theological arguments, the social expectations, they all pointed in the same direction. But actual capability does not follow the rules that formal structures try to impose on it. It finds the spaces where the rules do not quite reach. It moves through the gaps. It accumulates in the places that the rule-makers did not think to guard because they did not think those places mattered. The dowager position was one of those gaps. Widowhood, paradoxically, created a category of woman who was no longer quite as subject to the structures designed to contain her, because those structures had been built primarily around the figure of the wife. And the dowager was something else, something the law and custom acknowledged, but had not fully thought through. And the women who understood that, who had spent their years of marriage studying the map of power with patient attention, knew exactly where those gaps were. They had been waiting for them. Which leads us somewhere that I think is genuinely surprising, even in the context of everything we have covered. Because while widowhood gave some royal women their first real access to something approaching independent authority, there were others who did not wait, who did not want the gap, who went looking for the door. The women who actually fought back, who stepped out of the reactive mode entirely and became unambiguously the most powerful person in the room, were doing something categorically different from everything we have discussed so far. They were not surviving a dangerous marriage. They were dismantling the premise that the marriage was the thing that defined them. The stories of those women, Isabella of Castile, Eleanor of Castile, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Empress Matilda, are extraordinary in ways that set them apart even from the remarkable women we have been meeting throughout this series. And they are also, in many cases, far more costly, because stepping into direct power meant stepping directly into direct conflict. And direct conflict for a woman in this era carried consequences that were qualitatively different from anything we have yet discussed. That is where we are headed next. There is a moment in the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine that I keep returning to. Not because it is the most dramatic moment in her extraordinary story, though it is certainly dramatic, but because of what it reveals about the distance between surviving a marriage and refusing to be defined by one. The year is 1173. Eleanor is somewhere between 49 and 51 years old. Her exact birth year is disputed, and she has made a decision that by any reasonable measure should be described as one of the most audacious political acts of the 12th century. She has supported her own sons in an armed rebellion against her husband. Her husband is Henry II of England, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, a man of formidable intelligence, volcanic temper, and essentially unlimited capacity of holding a grudge. The rebellion fails. Eleanor is captured, reportedly, while disguised as a man and attempting to flee to France. Henry has her imprisoned. She will remain a prisoner, in various degrees of confinement, for the next 15 years. 15 years. Let that number settle for a moment. 15 years of captivity, in comfortable but restricted circumstances, with limited access to the wider world, at the hands of a man who had every legal right in the world to keep her there and no particular incentive to let her go. And yet, when Henry died in 1189, and their son Richard became king, one of Richard's first acts was to release his mother. Eleanor walked out of captivity at roughly 67 years old, an age at which most people in the 12th century, if they reached it at all, were considered ancient, and immediately began governing. She served as regent of England, while Richard went on crusade. She personally traveled to Germany to negotiate his ransom when he was captured by the Holy Roman Emperor. She crossed the Pyrenees Mountains in winter to escort Richard's intended bride from Spain to his court. She outlived Richard, and then positioned herself with remarkable strategic precision to support the reign of her youngest son, John. She died in 1204 at approximately 82 years old, having spent the final 15 years of her life as one of the most active political figures in Europe. 15 years of imprisonment, followed by 15 years of something approaching genuine freedom, and she used every day of the second 15 as if she were making up for the first. Here is what I want to sit with before we go any further. Eleanor of Aquitaine chose to fight back, directly, openly. She backed a military rebellion against her own husband, and the immediate consequence was severe. 15 years of her life gone. Was it worth it? That is not a question I can answer for her. It is barely a question I can answer for myself, and my circumstances are considerably more comfortable. But I think it is worth asking, because the answer is not obvious, and the asking reveals something important about the nature of the choice these women faced when they decided to step from strategy into outright resistance. Every survival strategy we have discussed so far in this series, the spy networks, the religious positioning, the pregnancy calculations, the food precautions, the dowager maneuvering, all of them shared a common logic. They worked within the system. They accepted, at least on the surface, the basic premise that a royal woman's power was secondary and conditional. They found ways to accumulate influence and safety and agency within those constraints, rather than attacking the constraints directly. Eleanor attacked the constraints directly, and the immediate result was catastrophic. The long-term result. She became one of the most consequential political figures of the 12th century, whose influence shaped the royal houses of both England and France for generations. Both things are true, and holding both of them simultaneously is, I think, the only honest way to look at the women in this part of our story. Empress Matilda is someone who deserves to be as famous as any monarch in English history, and is instead known primarily, if she is known at all, as the woman who lost. As the woman who lost, let me give you the shape of her story, because it matters. Matilda was the daughter of Henry I of England. She was his only surviving legitimate child after the death of her brother William in the White Ship disaster of 1120, an event that killed several hundred people and left Henry I without a male heir. Henry had Matilda formally recognized as his heir. The English barons swore oaths to support her succession twice. In fact, they swore these oaths formally, publicly, on holy relics. When Henry died in 1135, his nephew Stephen of Blois immediately seized the throne. The oaths, it turned out, were remarkably flexible when it came to the question of a woman actually ruling. What followed is known to historians as the Anarchy. 19 years of civil war between Matilda and Stephen, during which England was effectively ungovernable and the suffering of ordinary people was considerable. Matilda came close, genuinely close. In 1141, Stephen was captured at the Battle of Lincoln, and Matilda was recognized as Lady of the English, the formal title used in anticipation of her coronation. She never made it to the coronation. The citizens of London, who had initially accepted her, rose against her. The specific reasons are debated by historians, but contemporary accounts describe her as having behaved in a way that was perceived as arrogant and inflexible in negotiations with the Londoners. She had essentially demanded rather than persuaded. This detail has been used for centuries to argue that Matilda's failure was her own character flaw, that if she had been more diplomatic, more yielding, she would have succeeded. I want to push back on this, because I think it is too simple. Matilda was operating in a context where the very assertion of her right to rule was considered, by a significant portion of her contemporaries, as inherently transgressive. She was a woman claiming a throne that men felt entitled to hold. Every move she made was filtered through that lens, and behaviors that would have been described as appropriate firmness in a male claimant were described as arrogance in her. She could not win by being soft, because softness was read as weakness, and weakness disqualified her. She could not win by being firm, because firmness was read as arrogance, and arrogance disqualified her. The game was rigged, not by her character, but by the categories through which her character was being judged. She spent the rest of her life fighting, maneuvering, and eventually ensuring that her son, the future Henry II, yes, Eleanor of Aquitaine's husband, would succeed where she had not. She never became Queen of England in her own right, but her son became one of England's most consequential kings, and the entire Plantagenet dynasty that followed traces directly back to Matilda's refusal to accept Stephen's usurpation as the final word. She did not win, but she changed the outcome, and there is a form of victory in that I think deserves to be named. Now, let me take you somewhere a little darker, because not all of the women who fought back did so from a position of righteous grievance or thwarted legitimate claim. Some of them fought back from positions that were considerably more morally complicated. And those stories are, if anything, even more interesting, because they force us to grapple with the question of what we actually mean when we talk about survival and resistance and power. Isabella of France is known to history by a nickname that tells you exactly how history has chosen to remember her: the She-Wolf of France. She was the daughter of Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, and she married Edward II of England in 1308, when she was around 12 years old. Edward was 23. The marriage was, by almost every account, a disaster of incompatibility. Edward had strong emotional attachments to male favorites, first Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger, and the specific nature of those attachments has been a source of intense controversy at the time, and has been discussed and analyzed by historians ever since. What is clear, regardless of how we characterize those relationships, is that Isabella was systematically marginalized within her own marriage. Her lands were at times seized and given to Despenser. Her children were taken from her custody. Her access to resources was restricted. She was, to put it plainly, humiliated, consistently over years. And then in 1325, Isabella was sent to France on a diplomatic mission, negotiating between her husband and her brother, the French king, over territories in France claimed by the English crown. She went, and she did not come back. Instead, she formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, an English nobleman who had fled to France after escaping from the Tower of London. The relationship became romantic as well as political, and together they began planning something that had not been done successfully in England for over 3 centuries. They planned to depose a sitting king. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small force. The invasion succeeded with startling speed. Edward II had become so deeply unpopular that resistance essentially evaporated. Edward was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, who became Edward III. And Edward II died in captivity at Berkeley Castle in 1327 under circumstances that have been debated and disputed ever since. Isabella governed England as regent for her young son for the next 3 years, until 1330 when Edward III, now 17, staged his own coup. He arrested Mortimer, had him executed, and took control of his own kingdom. Isabella was not harmed. Edward sent her to live in comfortable circumstances at Castle Rising in Norfolk, where she remained, not quite a prisoner, but certainly not free, until the 1340s when her son gradually allowed her back into court life. She died in 1358, at approximately 63 years old. Isabella's story is morally complex, in ways that are genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. She was unambiguously the victim of a marriage that stripped her of dignity, resources, and basic security over many years. Her decision to fight back, to use the tools available to her, which in this case meant a foreign alliance, a political partner, and an invasion force, was a rational response to an untenable situation. It was also a response that resulted in her husband's death. Whatever exactly happened at Berkeley Castle, and historians remain genuinely divided, Edward II did not survive his captivity. How do we hold that? I think we hold it the same way we hold any complicated historical truth, by refusing the temptation to flatten it. Isabella was not simply a villain, and she was not simply a hero. She was a human being who had been pushed into an impossible situation, and who found the most dramatic possible exit from it. What her story illustrates for our purposes is the end point of the spectrum we have been tracing throughout this series. At one end, survival through quiet strategy, the networks, the faith, the careful relationships. At the other end, survival through direct confrontation, the open rebellion, the invasion, the deposition of a king. Both ends of that spectrum have their costs. The quiet end cost years of constrained existence, of performed deference, of living in the margins of someone else's power. The dramatic end cost sometimes everything: reputation, freedom, occasionally more than that. The women who chose the dramatic end knew the cost. Eleanor of Aquitaine knew it. Empress Matilda knew it. Isabella of France knew it. They chose anyway. Does that make them reckless? I do not think so. I think it makes them human in a way that is sometimes harder to see in the women who survived through quieter means. The quiet survivors are impressive precisely because they seem almost superhuman in their patience and their discipline. The women who fought back directly remind us that behind all of that patience and discipline were human beings with limits, with feelings, with feelings that could reach a breaking point, with a sense of their own dignity that could not be indefinitely compressed. Every person has a threshold. The threshold varies. What is extraordinary about the women in this series is not that any of them found perfect peace with their circumstances, but that so many of them found functional strategies for living within circumstances that would test most of us far beyond what we would want to admit. And sometimes the strategy was patience, and sometimes the strategy was rebellion. Both were forms of agency. Both were expressions of selfhood in conditions designed to erase it. Here is something I want to leave you with before we move forward. The women who fought back most visibly, Matilda, Eleanor, Isabella, all paid significant immediate costs. All of them experienced periods of captivity or exile or loss of control over their own lives as a direct consequence of their resistance. And yet, almost without exception, history's long-term verdict on them has been one of fascination rather than condemnation. We write books about Eleanor of Aquitaine. We make films. We are clearly drawn to her in a way that we are not always drawn to the quieter survivors. There is something in us, I think, that recognizes and responds to the choice to fight, even when fighting is costly, even when it is not clean, even when the outcome is not victory. Because fighting back, at its core, is an assertion of something fundamental, that the self has value, that dignity matters, that the person inside the political role is real, and has claims that cannot be entirely dissolved by the convenience of the powerful. That assertion, made under those conditions, at that cost is remarkable by any measure. And yet for every Eleanor of Aquitaine who fought and paid and ultimately shaped history, there were dozens of women who found different paths. Women who built their raw influence not through confrontation, but through something more patient and more durable. We have been circling around one particular group of these women throughout this entire series. Women who shared something specific, a set of qualities that appeared again and again in the ones who survived best across different countries and different centuries and different types of danger. The patterns are real. They are historically documented, and they point towards something that, when you see it clearly, feels almost like a formula, not a guarantee. Nothing in this world comes with guarantees, and especially not in theirs, but something close to a pattern of what it actually took, in practice, in documented historical reality, to do what so few managed, to come out the other side. We are almost there. That is exactly what we are going to look at next. Let us pull back for a moment from the individual stories, from the specific women and the specific courts and the specific crises we have been moving through, and look at the larger picture. Because when you do that, when you step back far enough to see the whole landscape, something becomes visible that is easy to miss when you are focused on any single life. The women who survived best across different countries, different centuries, different types of marriages, and different varieties of danger were almost never operating alone. Not in the deep sense, not in the sense that actually mattered. Yes, they were isolated in certain ways. Sent away from their families, dropped into foreign courts where they knew no one and where everyone around them had loyalties that predated her arrival and did not necessarily include her. Surrounded by the social and legal machinery of a world that defined them primarily through their relationship to a man. But the ones who endured, the ones who came through with something intact, had Almo. Invariably found ways to maintain connections that reached beyond the walls of their husband's court, threads running outward to the world they had come from, and sometimes to worlds they had deliberately cultivated from scratch. They were embedded in something larger than the marriage. And that embeddedness, it turns out, was often the difference between surviving and not. Let me tell you about Anne of Brittany, because her story is one of the most instructive and one of the least told in all of late medieval European history. Anne was the Duchess of Brittany in her own right, having inherited the duchy from her father, Francis II, in 1488. She was 11 years old at the time of her inheritance. Brittany was the last major independent territory in what is now France. A region with its own language, its own laws, its own fierce sense of identity, and a population that was deeply attached to its independence from the French crown. From the moment she inherited, every major power in the region was trying to control her. France wanted to absorb Brittany. The Holy Roman Empire had interests. Spain had interests. England had interests, and every one of those interests converged on the question of who this 11-year-old girl would eventually marry. She was betrothed multiple times. The Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, Margaret of Austria's father, whom we met in an earlier part of this series, actually married her by proxy in 1490. A proxy marriage was a real legal marriage conducted with a representative standing in for the absent spouse. Then the French invaded Brittany, and Anne, 19 years old, besieged in her own capital, with no realistic military means of resistance, made the decision that saved her duchy and shaped her life. She married the French King Charles VIII. To do this, she had to obtain an annulment of her proxy marriage to Maximilian, something fist. That was canonically complicated and diplomatically explosive, since Maximilian was understandably furious about the whole arrangement. But Anne navigated it. And here is what makes her story genuinely remarkable, from the perspective of this series. When she married Charles VIII, she negotiated a marriage contract that was, for its era, extraordinary in its protections for Brittany's independence. The duchy was not to be merged into France. It retained its own laws, its own institutions, its own identity. If Charles died before her, and they had no surviving children, she retained the duchy for herself. Charles died in 1498. They had no surviving children. Anne got Brittany back. She was 21 years old. She was then almost immediately under pressure to marry again, because an independent Duchess of Brittany was a problem the French crown very much wanted to solve. She married the new French king, Louis XII, in 1499, and once again she negotiated. Her second marriage contract was, if anything, even more carefully constructed than her first. She spent years using her position as Queen of France to advance Breton interests, appointing Breton officials, supporting Breton cultural and religious institutions, maintaining the administrative distinctiveness of the duchy. She was Queen of France twice. She used both marriages not just to survive, but to protect something she valued more than her own comfort: the independence and identity of the place and people she had been born to serve. When Anne of Brittany died in 1514 at 36 years old, she was mourned across France, and especially across Brittany, with a depth of genuine grief that is documented in multiple contemporary sources. Not because she had been a queen, but because she had been their duchess, because she had spent her life, through 2 strategic marriages and 2 carefully negotiated contracts, and decades of deliberate political positioning, protecting what she had been entrusted to protect. Her homeland was her alliance, and it had been her armor, too. Now the external alliance that Anne of Brittany maintained was, in her case, a territorial and institutional one. She was protecting a duchy, but the same principle operated in purely human terms for women whose resources were people rather than land. Philippa of Hainault is someone who does not appear in most popular histories of medieval England, which is a shame because she is, when you look at her closely, one of the most quietly effective political operators of the 14th century. She married Edward III of England in 1328, when they were both around 15 years old. The marriage lasted 33 years, until her death in 1369. Edward III was a formidable and frequently difficult man, a great military king, genuinely one of the most capable soldiers and commanders of his era, but also a king whose court was turbulent, whose ambitions constantly outran his resources, and whose later years were marked by the influence of a royal favorite, Alice Perez, who wielded considerable informal power. Philippa's response to all of this was not confrontation. It was not the kind of network building we talked about in Part 4, with coded letters and intelligence systems. It was something more fundamental and, in some ways, more powerful. She was genuinely, consistently, visibly kind. This sounds almost embarrassingly simple when I say it aloud, and I want to be clear that I do not mean it as a diminishment. What Philippa did was build, over 3 decades, a reputation for mercy and intercession and personal warmth that made her politically untouchable in a way that no amount of strategic maneuvering could have achieved as reliably. The most famous example is the burghers of Calais. In 1347, after a long siege, Edward agreed to spare the city of Calais on the condition that 6 of its leading citizens give themselves up to be executed. They came out barefoot, with ropes around their necks. Philippa, who was heavily pregnant at the time, reportedly fell to her knees before Edward and begged him to spare their lives. Edward, moved by his wife's intervention, agreed. Whether this scene happened exactly as described is something historians debate, but the fact that it was recorded, repeated, and celebrated tells us something important about Philippa's reputation, because people believed she would do something like this. They believed it because her behavior over 3 decades had established that intercession and mercy were genuinely characteristic of her. That reputation was an alliance. A broad, diffuse, deeply embedded alliance with an entire population. With the English people, with the nobility who had experienced her warmth, with the churchmen and scholars and artists whose work she had patronized. It protected her in ways no single powerful friend or wealthy family could. She was loved, and love in a political environment where so much depended on goodwill and loyalty is not nothing. It is not everything, but it is far from nothing. Let me add one more voice to this, because She is not well known outside specialist circles, and she deserves to be. Christina of Denmark. In 1538, Henry VIII, fresh from the execution of Jane Seymour, with Anne of Cleves not yet in the picture, was looking for a fourth wife. He sent ambassadors across Europe, and the portrait painter Hans Holbein the Younger was dispatched to capture the likeness of various candidates. One of those candidates was Christina, the Duchess of Milan. She was 16 years old, recently widowed, and by Holbein's portrait, which still exists and is genuinely beautiful, strikingly attractive, Henry was interested. Christine, according to a report sent back to the English court, delivered what has become one of history's most quietly devastating diplomatic rejections. She said, and I am paraphrasing the account, rather than quoting it directly, that if she had two heads, she might be willing to put one of them at the King of England's disposal. She was referring with 16-year-old clarity to the fate of Anne Boleyn. She declined, gracefully but unmistakably. Christina survived. She lived to 1590, dying at 68, having navigated the complicated politics of the Holy Roman Empire and the Italian territories with considerable skill across a very long life. Her ability to decline Henry VIII without giving him a pretext for offense, to say no in a way that was too clever to be called insult and too clear to be misunderstood, was itself a form of alliance management. She knew her value. She knew the risks. She knew that the most powerful protection she had was the ability to walk away from arrangements that threatened her while maintaining the relationships that supported her. That awareness of one's own value, of one's own options, is something that emerges again and again in the women who navigated these situations most successfully. The ones who believed at some fundamental level that they had choices, even when the choices were constrained, even when the options were difficult, tended to find choices that others missed. Here is a question I want to put to you directly. If you had been a royal woman in 15th or 16th century Europe, if you had woken up tomorrow in that world, with all the constraints and dangers we have spent these many hours examining, what do you think your instinct would have been? Would you have gone quiet and watchful, building slowly from the inside? Would you have reached outward for allies? Would you have fought? I find myself genuinely uncertain what my one answer would be. And I think that uncertainty is actually the appropriate response to these stories, because these women were not operating with perfect information and perfect clarity about the right path. They were making decisions under extraordinary pressure, with incomplete knowledge, in conditions that had no instruction manual. The ones who survived best were not the ones who had found the one true strategy and executed it perfectly. They were the ones who had maintained enough flexibility to respond to circumstances they could not fully anticipate, who had built enough redundancy into their survival systems, enough different kinds of protection, enough different relationships and resources and identities, that when one failed, something else held. Resilience, in other words, is a structure rather than a feeling. Now there is something that I have been building toward across all of these parts, and I think we are finally ready to name it directly. Because everything we have looked at, the spy networks, the religious positioning, the pregnancy strategies, the food precautions, the dowager maneuvering, the external alliances, even the direct rebellions, all of it, when you step back and look at it together, points toward a common underlying logic. These women were not just surviving individual threats. They were doing something more systematic than that. They were managing the conditions of their own survival as an ongoing practice. Not a single brilliant decision made under pressure, but a sustained, years-long, often decades-long, process of building and maintaining and adjusting the structures that kept them safe and functional. And when you look at the ones who did this most successfully, the ones who are the true survivors of this story, the women whose lives ended on their own terms, you find certain qualities appearing consistently across different eras and different countries and different political circumstances. There is a pattern, and it is not the pattern most people would expect. It is not about being tougher or smarter or luckier. It is more subtle than any of those things, and it is something that honestly has implications for how we think about resilience and agency that go well beyond the medieval court. The pattern, the real one, the one distilled from centuries of women's lives. That is where we are going next, and it may be the most interesting part of this entire journey. Stay with me, Of all the survival strategies we have examined in this series, the one I find most unsettling and perhaps most brilliant is also the one that is hardest to distinguish from its opposite, because there is a fine, almost invisible line between a woman who chooses to appear harmless as a deliberate act of strategic intelligence and a woman who is labeled harmless or powerless or unstable by the people around her, against her will, as a method of neutralizing her. One is a tool. The other is a weapon used against her. And the most chilling thing about the historical record is how often these two things happened simultaneously. Our woman who was genuinely playing a careful, considered game of appearing less threatening than she was could, in the wrong circumstances, find that the performance had been turned against her. That the mask had been pressed down so hard it became a cage. Sit with that for a moment, because it is important, and then let me show you what it looked like in practice. Start with someone who did it right, genuinely right, under conditions that would have defeated most people. The year is 1546. Catherine Howard has already been executed. Henry VIII is in his final years, physically diminished, politically volatile, and surrounded by factions competing ferociously over the question of who would control England after his death. Into this environment steps a woman named, and this matters, not a queen at all, not someone wielding power, a scholar, a quiet, deeply learned woman who had been appointed to serve as a companion and intellectual sparring partner to the aging king. She was, of course, Catherine Parr, whom we met in Part 4 from the angle of her intelligence network. But there is a dimension of Catherine's survival that we did not fully explore there, and it is the one I want to dwell on now. Catherine Parr was, by the standards of her era, radically educated. She had genuine theological convictions in the reformist direction, convictions that in Henry's England could get you burned. She had a sharp mind and a confidence in her own thinking that showed sometimes in her conversations with the king. The conservative faction at court saw this and recognized it immediately for what it was, a vulnerability. Not Catherine's vulnerability, their opportunity. They constructed a heresy charge against her with genuine care and skill. They gathered evidence of her theological views. They obtained Henry's signature on a warrant, and then Catherine found out. We do not know exactly how, but she found out, and what she did next is the purest example I know of in all of this period of the art of strategic self-diminishment, deployed with absolute precision. She went to Henry. She positioned herself not as his equal in theological discussion, which she was, but as his student. She told him that she had only ever raised these questions to learn from him, to benefit from his superior wisdom, to be corrected and guided by the greatest theological mind in England. Every word of this was calculated. Every word was also, in a sense she could live with, not entirely false. Because Henry was the king, and learning from the king was a form of deference that could be genuinely meant, even when it was also strategic. Henry called her a perfect wife. The warrant was dropped. Now here is what I want you to notice about this. Catherine did not become someone different in that room. She did not abandon her convictions. She did not stop being the scholar and theologian she actually was. She simply chose, with surgical precision, not to be visible as that person at that particular moment, to that particular man, in those particular circumstances. The intelligence is in the knowing. Knowing when to be fully yourself, and knowing when the cost of being fully yourself is higher than you can afford to pay, and knowing, crucially, the difference between those two moments. That is not weakness. It is one of the most demanding forms of self-knowledge that exists. But now let me show you the other side of this, because the other side is darker and more complicated, and needs to be looked at honestly. Joanna of Castile was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Those Saint Ferdinand and Isabella, whose combined reign united Spain, sponsored Columbus, and expelled Jews and Muslims from Iberian soil. She was, by any measure, the legitimate heir to one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. She was also, according to her father, her husband, and eventually her son, mad. The label attached itself to her so thoroughly, and so early, that she has come down through history, primarily as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, It has shaped every account of her life for 5 centuries. Here is what the historical evidence actually shows when you look at it carefully. Joanna was deeply, genuinely distressed by her husband Philip's repeated and very public infidelities. She responded to those infidelities with emotional intensity, with anger, with grief, with possessiveness that contemporaries found alarming. After Philip died suddenly in 1506, she was reportedly devastated. Story C. I circulated about her behavior with his coffin during the long journey to his burial site. Stories that have never been reliably verified, but that spread rapidly through European courts. Her father Ferdinand used the stories. He declared her incapable of ruling and governed Castile himself as her regent. After Ferdinand died in 1516, her son Charles, the future Charles V, did the same. Joanna was confined at Tordesillas, in comfortable but complete captivity for the next 46 years. 46 years. She was 50 years old when she entered Tordesillas. She died there at 75. Here's the question that historians have been wrestling with for the past century, as archival records have become more accessible and scholarship more rigorous. Was Joanna genuinely unable to govern? Or was she a politically inconvenient woman with legitimate claims to power whose emotional responses to legitimate grievances were weaponized by the men around her to justify removing her from the political equation? The answer most serious historians now believe is something closer to the second than the first. Joanna's madness was not nothing. She clearly suffered, clearly experienced periods of severe distress, clearly had a complicated relationship with the world around her. But complicated and incapable of ruling are not the same thing. And the evidence suggests that on the occasions when Joanna was given access to governance, when she was allowed to exercise the authority she legitimately held, she was capable of doing so coherently and effectively. The men who confined her had enormous incentives to keep her confined. Her release would have meant their loss of power. Her recognition as a competent ruler would have threatened everything they had built on the foundation of her supposed incapacity. And so the label held, the cage closed, and a woman who had committed the offense of ruler, grieving too visibly, of loving too intensely, of responding to genuine mistreatment, with emotions that made powerful men uncomfortable, spent nearly half a century in a gilded prison, while her father and then her son ruled her kingdoms in her name. I want to pause here and name something that I think is important. The Joanna of Castile situation is not just a historical curiosity. It is a pattern. Throughout medieval and early modern history, emotional expressiveness in royal women was dangerous. Not because the emotions were illegitimate, but because they provided cover for the people who wanted to remove these women from power. A woman who wept was fragile. A woman who raged was unhinged. A woman who grieved openly was unstable. A woman who loved intensely was obsessed. The same behaviors that were read in men as evidence of passion or strength or depth of feeling were read in women as evidence of incapacity, and this created a trap with no clean exit. The women who suppressed their feelings entirely and performed perfect composure were praised as dignified, but they were also, in a way, disappearing, making themselves legible to the court's expectations by erasing whatever was most personally themselves. The women who allowed themselves to be visible in their emotions risked exactly what happened to Joanna, having that visibility weaponized against them. The women who tried to navigate the middle path against them. The women who tried to navigate the middle path, who chose carefully which emotions to show and to whom and when, were doing something extraordinarily difficult with their inner lives, essentially running a constant internal negotiation between authenticity and safety that most people never have to manage at that level. Lady Jane Grey is someone who occupies a unique place in this particular part of our story, because she was, in a very specific sense, destroyed not by her emotions but by her intelligence, by the inability or unwillingness to make herself appear less than she was at moments when appearing less might have saved her. Jane was named Queen of England in 1553 by the dying Edward VI, a 9-day reign that ended when Mary Thy successfully claimed the throne that was rightfully hers. Jane was 16 years old when she became queen. She was 17 when she was executed. She had not sought the crown. She had by multiple accounts been deeply reluctant to accept it, understanding with the kind of clear-eyed intelligence that characterized her throughout her short life that the position was being handed to her not for her benefit, but for the benefit of the men around her, particularly her father-in-law, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. After Mary took the throne, Jane was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and here is where the narrative becomes particularly poignant. Mary initially did not want to execute Jane. She recognized that Jane had been used as a pawn, that she bore limited personal responsibility for the coup that had briefly displaced her. What changed was not Jane's behavior. It was her father's. Henry Grey, the Duke of Suffolk, joined a Protestant rebellion against Mary in early 1554, and his rebellion made Jane's continued existence politically impossible for Mary's government. Jane was executed in February of 1554. What I find heartbreaking about Jane's story in the context of this series is the question of whether a different performance, a more deliberate suppression of her Protestant convictions, a more complete deference to Mary's religious position might have saved her. The honest answer is possibly not. Mary's political position after her father's rebellion was genuinely difficult, and the calculus around Jane's survival involved factors entirely outside Jane's control. But Jane's complete inability to dissemble, to perform a submission she did not feel, to appear less certain of her Protestant faith than she was, is documented clearly in contemporary accounts. She was, by every measure, a person of extraordinary integrity. She said what she believed. She refused the performances of conformity that might have bought her more time. Was that courage? Absolutely. Was it also in the brutal calculus of survival in that particular historical moment, a decision that foreclosed options that might otherwise have remained open? Also, yes, and I do not say that to criticize her. I say it because I think it illuminates something real about the nature of the choice these women faced, the trade-off between authenticity and survival that sat at the heart of so many of their lives. Sophia Dorothea of Celle is someone whose story belongs in this discussion and is rarely placed here. She was the wife of George I of Great Britain. Yes, the first of the Hanoverian kings, the one who barely spoke English and had to be explained to through an interpreter. She was beautiful, intelligent, and deeply unhappy in a marriage to a man who was publicly unfaithful and personally cold. She had an affair with a Swedish count named Philip Christoph von Königsmark. The count disappeared in 1694, almost certainly killed, though his body was never definitively found, and Sophia Dorothea was put on trial for what was termed malicious abandonment of her husband. The marriage was dissolved, and she was imprisoned at Olden Castle, in what is now Germany. She remained there for 32 years, until she died in 1726. 32 years of captivity for a relationship that, in any moral reckoning, was a response to a marriage that had already failed in every meaningful sense. Her children, including the future George II of Great Britain, were forbidden from seeing her. She reportedly never accepted that she had done anything requiri. In imprisonment, she never submitted, never performed the contrition that might possibly have softened her captivity. She died having never left Olden Castle after her imprisonment began. Here is the through line that connects Catherine Parr's perfectly timed submission, Joanna of Castile's weaponized grief, Lady Jane Grey's integrity, and Sophia Dorothea's refusal to perform contrition. The art of appearing harmless, or appearing whatever the moment required, was genuinely a survival skill. Catherine Parr used it brilliantly, and it saved her life. There is no question about that, but it was also a skill that existed in a world that could turn any performance against the woman performing it. Joanna's distress was real, and it was used to cage her. Sophia Dorothea's refusal to perform submission was principled, and it cost her 32 years. The women who navigated this most successfully were not simply better at performing. They were better at reading the specific person and the specific moment, at understanding when a performance of submission would be received as submission, and when it would simply be absorbed and then ignored in favor of whatever outcome had already been decided. That reading, that precision, is an art form, One that these women developed not in comfortable circumstances, not with time for reflection and experimentation, but in real time, under genuine pressure, with everything at stake. And when it worked, it was invisible. Nobody wrote down that a queen had just successfully managed her image in a way that saved her life. They wrote down that she was a perfect wife, a pious woman, a gracious queen. The intelligence behind the performance went unrecorded because that was the point. And this brings me, finally, to the question that I think ties this entire series together. When we look at all of these women, the spy networks, and the religion, they choose positioning and the pregnancy strategies and the external alliances, and the strategic self-presentation, and the outright rebellions. What is the actual common thread? What do the ones who truly survived have in common? Not the tools. The tools varied enormously. What Blanche of Castile used was not what Herm Sultan used. What Catherine Parr deployed was not what Eleanor of Aquitaine deployed. Not the circumstances. The circumstances were widely different. Different countries, different centuries, different husbands, different political landscapes. So what was it? I have been thinking about this for a long time, and I want to share what I have come to. Not as a definitive historical claim, but as what feels to me like the truest answer the evidence supports. The ones who survived had, in some form that was entirely their own, never fully accepted the premise that the marriage was the whole of them. They had kept something, an identity, a purpose, a relationship, a conviction that existed outside the husband's definition of who they were. Something they were not willing to surrender. Something that persisted through the performance, through the submission, through the danger, through the grief. And it was that something, that irreducible core, that gave them the resilience to keep going when everything external had been stripped away or threatened. What that looked like in practice, in the specific lives of the women who came out the other side with something real intact, is what we are going to explore in our final chapter. And I think it is going to be the most personal part of this entire journey, for them and possibly for you. Stay with me. We are almost home. We have come a long way together. Think about where we started. That image of a young woman in heavy robes, cheering crowds around her, a crown being placed on her head, the golden surface of something that looked from the outside like a fairy tale. And think about everything we have walked through since then. The betrothals signed when girls were barely old enough to read. The husbands who held absolute power and sometimes used it absolutely. The spy networks built in secret, one trusted servant at a time. The pregnancies that were political events as much as human ones. The food tasted by proxy. The letters written in code. The prayers offered in chapels that were also, quietly, fortresses. We have met women who endured 15 years of imprisonment and came out governing. Women who negotiated treaties across war tables. Women who declined Henry VIII with a line so perfectly delivered it has echoed through 5 centuries. Women who sat beside dying kings and talked them out of their own worst decisions. And now I want to do something I have been saving for this final chapter. I want to tell you what they actually had in common. Not the strategies. The strategies varied. But underneath the strategies, underneath the spy networks and the religious patronage and the carefully managed pregnancies and the strategic submissions, there was something else, something quieter. Something that, when you see it clearly, turns out to be both simpler and more profound than any individual tactic. Let me start with someone who is not always the first name that comes to mind when we think about royal survival, but who I think illustrates the pattern most vividly, Caterina Sforza. She was the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Milan, born around 1463, and she became the Countess of Forlì through her first marriage to Girolamo Riario, a nephew of Pope Sixtus IV. Italy, in the late 15th century, was a landscape of constantly shifting alliances, territorial ambitions, and sudden violence. Think of it as a chessboard where the pieces occasionally stabbed each other between moves. In 148, her husband, Girolamo, was assassinated by a conspiracy of local nobles. The conspirators seized Caterina's children as hostages and demanded that she surrender the citadel of Forlì, which she controlled. Katerina negotiated access to the citadel to arrange the surrender, and then she did not surrender, and then she did not surrender. She stood on the walls, pregnant it is believed with her sixth child, and reportedly told the conspirators that they could do whatever they wished with her children, because she was already carrying another. Whether she actually said this or something like it, historians debate. The story is possibly embellished, but here is what is not embellished. She held the citadel. She sent word to her allies. Within days, the political situation had shifted enough that the conspirators' position collapsed. Her children were released unharmed. She governed for Lee for the next decade, building its fortifications, negotiating with the Medici and the Sforzas and the papacy, raising her children, corresponding with ambassadors across Italy. When Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brother, one of the most militarily capable and ruthlessly ambitious men of the Renaissance, invaded Forlì in 1499 with a French army behind him. Caterina held out for weeks against forces that were objectively overwhelming. She was eventually captured. She was held prisoner in the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome. She secured her release through diplomatic pressure, her connections, her correspondence, her carefully maintained relationships with people who had reason to want her free. She was released in 1501. She retired to Florence. She spent her remaining years managing a farm, conducting agricultural experiments, compiling a manuscript of recipes and remedies that she had collected over decades, a document covering everything from medicine to cosmetics to practical household management that historians consider one of the more remarkable personal archives of the Renaissance. She died in 1509 at approximately 46 years old. Not an extraordinarily long life, not a life without catastrophic losses. She lost husbands, she lost territory, she lost years to imprisonment, but here is what she never lost: her sense of what she was capable of. That is the thread. That is what I keep finding when I look at the women in this series, who came through with something real intact. Not luck, not the right husband or the right country or the right century. A fundamental, stubbornly maintained conviction about their own capability and their own worth that no external circumstance managed to fully extinguish. Let me be more precise about what I mean, because I think precision matters here. I am not talking about confidence in the cheerful, uncomplicated sense. Several of these women had periods of profound doubt, genuine fear, what we would probably now recognize as depression. Catherine de' Medici spent a decade not knowing if she would ever bear children, in a court that watched her with cold calculation. Eleanor of Aquitaine spent 15 years in a room that was not her own. Caterina Sforza lost her husband to assassination and a county to invasion. Doubt is not the opposite of this quality. It coexists with it. What I am pointing to is something more structural, an internal relationship with their own identity that was robust enough to survive external assault, a sense of self that had been built on something solid enough, education, faith, purpose, relationships, or simply a very clear-eyed understanding of their own mind, that it could be bent under pressure without breaking. The women who did not have this, or who had it dismantled before they could use it, are the ones whose stories ended badly. Not always through dramatic violence, sometimes through the quiet erosion of a self that had never been given enough foundation to stand on when the pressures came. There is a pattern in how the survivors built this foundation, and it is consistent enough across different times and places that I think it is real rather than coincidental. They almost all had access early in their lives to something that gave them an identity beyond the marriage. For some, it was education. Catherine Parr, Margaret of Navarre, Lady Jane Grey, women whose intellectual lives gave them an interior world that was genuinely their own, that existed independently of what any husband thought of them or needed from them. For some, it was a territory, a people, a place they were responsible for in a way that had nothing to do with a marriage. Anne of Brittany had Brittany. Caterina Sforza had Forli. Margaret of Austria had the Netherlands. Caterina Sforza had the Netherlands. They were governors, not just wives. They had subjects who depended on them in ways that created obligations running in both directions. For some, it was faith. Not the performed faith we discussed as a political tool, but genuine spiritual conviction that gave them a framework for understanding their suffering that was larger than the suffering itself. Blanche of Castile, Isabella of Portugal, Hedwig of Silesia. For some, it was simply a relationship, a friendship, a correspondence, a bond with a child, or a sister, or a trusted lady-in-waiting that was so genuinely reciprocal, so fully human on both sides, that it reminded them continuously that they were people worthy of being known and valued. Different foundations, the same structural function, something to stand on when everything else was taken away. Here is the other thing I noticed, and I want to share it because I think it is the most quietly radical finding of this entire series. The women who survived best were almost without exception women who were genuinely interested in something, Bayo, and their own survival. I know that sounds counterintuitive. When we are under threat, we think the answer is to focus entirely on the threat, to make survival the only priority. And at extreme moments, that is probably true. But as a sustained life strategy, pure survival focus seems to have had a corrosive effect on the women who adopted it. The ones who were consumed entirely by the politics of their position, who had no genuine interest or investment in anything beyond managing the next threat. Those women often exhausted themselves, became isolated, lost the relationships and the credibility and eventually the resilience that genuine survival required. Contrast this with the women who maintained real interests. Caterina Sorsa compiling her manuscript of remedies, Catherine Parr writing theology, Blanche of Castile building institutions, Margaret of Austria collecting art, Philippa of Hainaut cultivating poets and chroniclers at her court. She was, among other things, the patron who brought the poet Geoffrey Chaucer to prominence, which is something I find endlessly charming. A woman with genuine interest was a woman with energy that replenished itself, with a reason to get up and think and engage with the world that existed outside the immediate crisis, with, in other words, a life, not just a survival. And the life, the genuine, invested, curious, interested life, turned out to be the fuel that survival ran on. Do you know what I find most moving about all of this? None of it required being extraordinary in the heroic Hollywood sense. Eleanor of Aquitaine was extraordinary in that sense. She was a genuinely larger-than-life figure who made enormous bets and paid enormous prices and shaped centuries of history. But Philippa of Hainaut was not Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was kind. She was consistent. She remembered people's names. She asked after their families. She used her position to make the space around her slightly more humane than it would otherwise have been. And she survived 33 years of marriage to one of England's most demanding kings, retained genuine influence throughout, and died as she had lived, respected, mourned, and secure. Extraordinary kindness, sustained over decades in conditions that might easily have produced bitterness. That is also remarkable. It just does not look like armor from the outside. Let me tell you the thing that has stayed with me longest through all the research and reading and thinking that has gone into this series. It is not the big dramatic moments, not the sieges or the executions, or the coded letters or the treaty negotiations. It is the smaller thing. It is Caterina Sforza, after losing her county and serving time as a prisoner, going home to a farm in Florence, and writing down recipes. Think about that for a moment. She had been at the peak of her power, a ruler, a military commander, a figure who had stood on fortification walls and defied armies, and then she lost, and was imprisoned, and was released. And what she did with the life she had remaining was she wrote things down, things she knew, things she had learned, things she thought were worth preserving. There is something in that choice that moves me in a way I find hard to fully articulate. It is the choice of someone who has not been defeated in the deepest sense. Someone who still believes that what she knows matters, that the world is worth contributing to, that there is a future worth leaving something for. That is not the behavior of someone who has had their sense of self extinguished. That is the behavior of someone who, against every odd, is still here, still present, still themselves. And this, I think, is the real answer to the question we have been circling throughout this series. How did the ones who made it actually make it? Not by being luckier, though luck played a role. Not by being perfectly strategic, though strategy mattered. Not by being tougher or colder or more ruthless than the women who did not survive, though sometimes toughness was necessary. They made it because in some essential and fiercely protected part of themselves, they had never agreed to be only what the marriage needed them to be. They had kept something back, some corner of themselves that remained theirs, that they tended quietly and refused to surrender. That gave them, even on the worst days, even in the hardest years, something to return to, a sense of who they were when no one was watching, when the performance was over, when the crown was off and the candles were out and it was just them. That was the real survival. Not the throne, not the alliance, not the heir themselves. I have spent a great deal of time with these women over the past months, reading everything I could find, following threads through archives and scholarly articles, and centuries of interpretation and reinterpretation. And the feeling I come away with, the thing I carry when I close the books, is not what I expected when I started. I expected admiration. I found admiration. These women are genuinely, objectively remarkable. But what I did not expect was something closer to recognition, because the things that kept them going, the sense of identity that persisted under pressure, the relationships that reminded them of their own worth, the interests and purposes that gave their days meaning beyond mere survival, the quiet refusal to be entirely defined by someone else's needs and someone else's power. These are not medieval things. They are human things. The conditions these women faced were specific to their time and place. The castle walls, the political marriages, the absence of legal standing, the ever-present question of the heir. All of that belongs to a world that thankfully no longer exists in the same form, but the underlying challenge of maintaining a sense of self in circumstances that press against it, of finding ways to preserve your own integrity within systems that do not always support it, of building the relationships and resources and inner life that will hold you when external conditions fail. That is not specific to any century. That is the oldest human project there is. We began this journey with a question. What if the most dangerous thing a woman could do was simply say, "I do," to a king? And the answer, it turns out, is both darker and more hopeful than the question suggested. Yes, it was dangerous, profoundly, structurally, sometimes fatally dangerous in ways that we have spent many hours exploring honestly. But the women who walked into that danger, the ones who survived it, the ones who built something real within it, the ones who came out the other side still recognizably themselves, did something that deserves more than a footnote. They showed us what human beings are capable of when the stakes are the highest, not in the battlefield sense. In the quieter, harder, more enduring sense. They showed us that survival, real survival, not just biological continuation, but the survival of the self, is possible in conditions designed to prevent it. And they showed us that the tools of that survival were never really weapons or walls or armies. They were knowledge, relationships, faith, purpose, and the stubborn, irreducible insistence on remaining, in some essential way, themselves. Thank you. Genuinely, thank you for spending this time with these women and with me. If you have made it all the way to this point, through all 12 parts of this journey, then you are exactly the kind of person I most love making these stories for. Someone who is willing to soz it with history long enough to let it actually breathe, to let the people in it become real, to let their experiences mean something beyond a date on a timeline. If this series moved you, surprised you, made you think about someone in your life who has survived something quietly remarkable, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Tell me which woman's story stayed with you most. Tell me what you are thinking about at the end of all of this. And if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of storytelling, someone who loves history, told this way, slowly and honestly, and with the respect these lives deserve, please share this with them. That is how stories like these find the people who need them. There are more stories waiting. Stories of women who built empires from nothing, of men who gambled everything on a single night, of ordinary people who found themselves at the center of events that changed the world, told the same way we have told this one. Slowly, carefully, with all the texture and complexity these lives deserve. So, whenever you are ready to settle in again, whenever the night is quiet, and you want a story worth staying awake for, I will be here. Until then, rest well.